Good morning, everybody. Hi. Welcome to the Massachusetts State House. It's an honor and pleasure to have you here. This is your house. So for those who don't come here often, come back and visit us often and let your voices be heard. For those who don't know me, my name is Dan Wolf. I have the pleasure of serving Cape Cod and the islands of Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and Gosnold as the state senator. And it's an honor to have you here. We're here to discuss, and I want to welcome our dignitaries, and Sean Corcoran is going to be introducing you to them as we get going with the program. But just a couple of introductory remarks from the state senator whose district is downwind of the Pilgrim nuclear power plant, and a little bit of my background as I roll into that. I learned to fly airplanes. For those who don't know, I'm the founder and CEO of Cape Air, in addition to being the state senator. And I learned to fly on Cape Cod in 1978. And 35 years ago, when I learned to fly, I noticed that there was a power plant on the shores of Plymouth. And I became acquainted from the air with the Pilgrim nuclear power plant. And for 35 years of flying, I've watched that plant. As I've watched the rest of our region grow and develop and change over the years, that plant has been there. And as I became state senator, I learned more and more about the history and politics and how that plant fits in both to the environment and the economy and the future of the region that I serve. And I've become increasingly concerned. And a minute about why I've become increasingly concerned. And even before the accident at Fukushima that you're going to be hearing a lot about today. When the deal was made for the Pilgrim nuclear power plant to be placed in Plymouth, the deal was we would have that power plant there for 40 years. The deal was that after 40 years, which was the design life, it would be decommissioned. The deal was that during those 40 years, as nuclear fuel was used, that spent fuel would be removed from the plant. And there is a storage pool there that was designed to hold 800 fuel rod units and now holds 3,200 fuel rods units, as you know. That was the deal. As we approached the 40-year life of that plant, a relicensing process began, which asked us to relicense that plant for another 40 years. And my participation in that, actually for 20 years, and my participation in that was to say, that plant has run out. It has served its useful life. What really is the responsible thing for us to do with that land and with that plant? And it became more and more problematic to me to see us going through a process that would have that plant be there for another 20 years, past the design life, past when it was supposed to be there, based on a lot of the safety assumptions that were made. And then right in the middle of that dialogue came the accident in Japan. Again, we're going to be discussing that a lot today. And for me, that sealed the deal as to why we shouldn't even consider relicensing that plant. Now, not only have I looked at that plant from above, but I also happen to be an aircraft mechanic, a technician, somebody who's used to maintaining and repairing aging equipment. And I have a sense of what it takes and what it means. And I actually, with a group of legislators, toured through that plant about a year and a half ago and walked through most of the plant and saw most of the technology that we had access to. And I was even more concerned after that. Three things happen as equipment gets old, and you can relate it from anything as simple to your automobile to as complicated as the space shuttle. Three things happen. The first thing is convenience items start to fail. Lights don't go on. Things that aren't really important to the safety and functioning start to not be as reliable. The second thing is systems start to fail. Pumps, motors, lines, valves, all of those things that we've heard about at Pilgrim that have caused shutdowns over the last couple of years. And then the third thing is you have catastrophic failure. And as a technician, I will tell you, you're going to hear all kinds of reasons from the industry about why this is different, but I urge you not to believe that. So, as a public servant, and yes, I'm a business person, I'm a pilot, and I'm a mechanic, but here today I stand as a public servant. One of our primary functions of a public servant is public safety. Our job is to guarantee the residents and the citizens that from a public policy standpoint, we are looking out for your safety first and foremost. And when you look at this plant through the filter of 40 years old, another 20, and you look at it through the filter of we don't really need the energy, and you look at it from the filter of what is the risk? What happens if a catastrophic event happens? Most of my district becomes uninhabitable, as you're going to hear. That would be the evacuation zone, and you're probably not going to be able to come back. The risk-reward analysis of that plant just doesn't make sense. So I think the public policy and public servant aspect of this is to work towards a decommissioning of the plant in a responsible way. It's 650 jobs. Part of our job in the public sector is to figure out where those people are going to work to support their families. But the risk-reward matrix, the risk-reward matrix of the Pilgrim nuclear power plant doesn't work. We don't need the electricity, and even though, and I believe it's the case, that the risk of a catastrophic event is very small, the catastrophe and the consequences of that event simply don't make the risk worth it. When the decision was made to put that plant there, I was 12 years old. The legacy we leave our children, if that plant is allowed to be there for 60 years, I will be 75 years old. And I will tell you, if you want to see how aging systems function, compare my body at 12 with my body at 75. That is a long time for us to rely on the technical safety and to believe the corporate interest that's at stake here. And one final closing. I've asked this questions at a lot of the events I've done relative to this power plant. Other than satisfying the shareholder needs of Entergy, and I believe we have some folks from Entergy here today, so I'd love to discuss it with them as well. Other than satisfying the shareholder needs of that corporation, why should we as the public sanction, endorse, or allow the 20-year extension of that plant? What's in it for us? That corporation is headquartered in New Orleans, Louisiana. And I want to know what's in it for us other than the risk. And the risk relative to the catastrophic consequence is real, and don't believe otherwise. I toured the plant as a technician, and I was hoping to be satisfied and comforted by what I saw, and actually it was just the opposite. And if I was the prime speaker here today, I would go on a little bit about what concerned me. I'm happy to do that later in the Q&A. But for now, it is my belief, in case you think I'm the moderator, I'm not, because a moderator is supposed to be more fair and objective. I'm here today because I believe that that plant should be shut down. I believe we have a responsibility to relocate the workers there and to understand the financial impact for the town of Plymouth that does receive significant tax revenue. We need to solve all of those challenges and address all of those issues, but we also need to address the public safety, the real public safety issue on and around the Pilgrim nuclear power plant. So that having been said, I want to thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for being here and for helping us understand what happened in Japan and how it's relevant to our situation here in Massachusetts. To my fellow legislators, such that you're here today, I ask you to join with me in understanding that part of our role is to address this as public servants and legislators in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Thank you very much all for being here today, and I look forward to talking.
Good morning. Thank you, Senator. I'm Sean Corcoran. I'm a reporter on staff at WGBH Radio in Boston, but I'm based on Cape Cod and Woods Hole, where I've done extensive reporting on the Pilgrim nuclear power plant. and it's my pleasure to be here today. Let me do just a few housekeeping things so you know what's going on. It's a wonderful agenda that we have, and we have some great speakers. I hope you were able to pick up an agenda. Of course, the former Japanese Prime Minister, Mr. Naoto Kan, is here, and he'll be speaking. Former NRC Chairman, Mr. Gregory Yazko, is here. He's right here. And Arnie Gunderson is here. He's down that end, and Arnie has been involved in the industry for about 40 years now. He's also quite an expert on the Mark I reactors, which is what we have at Pilgrim. And of course, former NRC Commissioner Peter Bradford is here as well. So we'll be hearing from them. They're live streaming this, so you can text your friends, let them know that they can get online and watch this as well. I hope you do, and that the web address is on the agenda. If you don't have an agenda, it's, let's see, it is new.livestream.com, Fukushima Lessons/Boston. So we will be having some questions, and there's going to be some cards floating around. You can put your question on there, and we'll be picking those up a little bit later, and we'll try to prioritize those and get as many in as we can. The media also will be asking some questions at the microphone. Let's see, we'll do our best to get to your questions. I'm sure you're going to help me maintain proper decorum, and I don't think that will be a problem with this group at all. I'd hate to eject anybody, but I'm feeling big today, so it should be okay. Right now, we're going to bring you a brief film by Jean-Michel Cousteau. So we'll take a look at that.
I'm Jean-Michel Cousteau. I'm honored to have a chance to offer my thoughts on the critical issue of nuclear power in New York and Boston. I regret that due to prior commitments, I cannot be with you in person. My initial introduction to the ocean by my father, Jacques Cousteau, impressed upon me some important fact about our planet. These were, we live on a planet bathed in two fluids, the ocean and the atmosphere. These fluids are in constant motion, each interacting with the other and each reaching every corner of the planet. Because of these facts, nothing can be thrown away because there is no away. Everything is connected, and whatever pollutant is released anywhere on the planet has the potential to have impacts everywhere. I believe these facts are particularly relevant to the discussion about nuclear power. Human arrogance and error are part of reality as are natural disasters totally out of our control. This means that it is absolutely certain that there will be unpredictable events capable of upsetting the best of our human engineered enterprises. In the case of a power, human error and natural disaster may topple a wind generator, damage a photovoltaic panels, and even destroy a petroleum-based power plant. But the consequences of these will be microscopic compared to the impact of a nuclear power plant going down. This has been proven true with the Fukushima and Chernobyl catastrophes. Those who choose to ignore the past are doomed to repeat it. I urge you to learn from Fukushima and Chernobyl so we don't have to see these catastrophes repeated. I applaud all of you for addressing the important issue of nuclear power plant and trust you will think of your children and all future generations to come as you make important policy decisions. I want to thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you and hope that great decisions can be made for the future of our species.
Okay, let me introduce our next speaker, former Japanese Prime Minister, Mr. Naoto Kan, who led the government response to the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Mr. Kan is the son of an engineer, and he studied physics at the Tokyo Institute of Technology, where he became interested in both politics and activism. And he began running for different offices in the 1970s, and he reportedly gained a great deal of attention nationally in Japan at that time, several years later when he was Minister of Health and Wellness. It was then the Japanese people got a sense of his blunt, tell-it-like-it-is style. And while serving as Japanese Prime Minister, he faced several crises, including fiscal issues and some conflicts with China, but it was in March 2011 that the world watched as he played his role in dealing with the nuclear disaster at Fukushima. And since then, he's become an outspoken critic of nuclear power, and you'll have a chance to ask him a little bit about that later on. But ladies and gentlemen, please welcome former Japanese Prime Minister Naoto Kan.
まず講演を始める前に、2011年の3月11日の大震災とそれに伴う原発事故に対して、ボストンをはじめアメリカの皆さんに大変なサポートをいただいたことを当時の総理として改めて心からお礼を申し上げます。
Before I start my speech, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank people in Boston and also people in the United States for giving us tremendous support in the aftermath of the year 2011, March 2011 earthquake and the subsequent nuclear disaster.
今回、このピルグリム原発のあるボストンに招かれたことは私にとっても大変、嬉しいことであります。この機会に福島原発の事故について、特に最初の5日間の状況について、避難の問題を含めて皆さんにお話をしたいと思います。
It is my honor and pleasure to be here, to be invited to Boston, which has a nuclear power plant, Pilgrim nuclear power plant close by. And I'd like to speak a little about the 5 days in the aftermath of the disaster, including the what happened in terms of evacuation and so on.
福島で事故が起きた原発の1号機はピルグリムの原発とほぼ同時期に同じメーカーで作られた同じ型の原発であります。
Fukushima Daiichi power plant's #1 reactor is almost identical to that of a Pilgrim nuclear power plant. It was about of the same age, about the same age.
この原発が地震からわずか5時間後にメルトダウン、さらにはメルトスルーをした、このことについて順を追ってお話をしたいと思います。
So now I'm going to explain to you what happened at this #1 reactor. It went through meltdown and eventually melt through.
3月11日の午後2時46分、大地震が起きました。そして最初に私、総理に来た原発についてのお知らせは、無事にすべての原発が停止をしたという知らせでした。その時はほっとしました。
The earthquake occurred at 2:46 in p.m. and the initial report that came to me as the Prime Minister was that the reactors were safely shut down, and that I was greatly relieved to hear that report.
しかしそれからわずか1時間 後には、すべての電源が喪失をした。さらにその直後には、すべての冷却機能が停止をしたという知らせが来ました。
But in about an hour, I received another report that said they have lost all the external power. And soon after that, another report came that said that they have also lost the cooling capacity.
ピルグリム原発でも今年、吹雪によって外部からの電源が途絶えたことがあったそうでありますが、福島原発の場合は外部からの電源が途絶えた上に緊急用の発電機が津波で、破壊をされて、すべての電源を失ったわけです。
I understand that at the Pilgrim nuclear power plant, you also had like a lost power, external power this year due to snowstorm. And at the Fukushima Daiichi #1 reactor, they have not only lost external power, but also the emergency, backup power system failed.
すべての冷却機能が失われると、原子力発電所の場合は燃料の自己崩壊熱によって、水が蒸発をしてメルトダウンを起こす、そのことについて私も、そうなることの知識を持っておりました。
If at the time I had this knowledge a little about nuclear technology, and if you lose all the power to keep the cooling system running, then eventually the decay heat will cause the meltdown.
ですから冷却機能がすべて失われたと聞いたときには本当に背筋が寒くなる思いをいたしました。
So because of that, when I heard that the news that they report that the plant lost the cooling capacity, I was completely shocked and just a chill run through my spine.
そして、今分かっていることは、最初の段階では電源が失われても機能するアイソレーションコンデンサー IC という装置が1号機についておりまして、それが機能して、冷却が行われている、最初はそういう報告がやってきました。
Well, now I understand, but at the #1 reactor, they actually had isolation condenser, and that was supposed to kick in when they have lost the external power.
しかし実際には約40年間このアイソレーションコンデンサーを使ったこのトレーニングはされていなかったために、作業員がせっかく動いた IC を止めていた。しかもそのことを所長、オペレーションの責任者は、気がつかなかった。こういうことが生じておりました。
一旦動かしてから止めたわけですか？Oh. So because of the lack of training, for 40 years, the plant had not done training of using the isolation condenser. During that time of accident, workers actually started the condenser, but they ended up stopping it. And that was it. 所長がそれを
知らなかった。
And then the plant manager didn't know about this.
そして圧力容器の中の水の水位置がまだかなり高いところにあるというのが私にもかなりの間報告が来ておりました。しかしその水位計が後になって壊れていたことが分かりました。
I was receiving reports also that the water level in the pressure vessel was high. I mean, was maintaining the level high enough to be safe. But then later, it was found that the gauge, water gauge, was broken.
その結果、地震が起きたその日の午後8時頃には、1号機がメルトダウンし、そしてさらにはこの20センチの厚さのある圧力容器の底を溶かして 溶けた燃料が格納容器の底に落ちるというメルトスルーという世界で初めての事故に発展しました。
As a result, in about 5 hours later, like 8 p.m. of the evening, at reactor number 1, the melted fuel, basically melted the 20 centimeter thickness of the bottom wall of the pressure vessel, which is about 8 inches, I believe, and the melted fuel melt through, and then it went to the bottom of the containment vessel.
格納容器の底の部分にコンクリートが打ってありまして、溶けた燃料はそのコンクリートを熱で、破壊を始めました。
破壊、
こう熱でコンクリートそのものを破壊をし始めました。
So because of on the bottom of the containment vessel is a concrete, and it's concrete. So the heat from that the concrete was basically starting to fail.
もしそのまま溶けた燃料が格納容器から外に、大量に出ていれば、人間が近づくことはほとんど短時間の死を意味する、そういう状況になったでしょう。
Had the melted fuel escaped through the barrier of concrete to the outside, then the consequence of the accident would have been a lot worse, a complete catastrophe.
幸いその段階で外から水を中に入れることができまして、それによって、コンクリートのこの破壊が止まり、温度を下げることができるようになりました。
Fortunately, they started to pump water into the reactor, and they were able to stop the heat from rising further. Therefore, they prevented the concrete from failing completely.
しかし、翌日の12日の午後には、1号機は水素爆発を起こしました。
But the next day, the reactor number 1 had the hydrogen explosion.
また2号機、3号機は別の IC とは別の冷却装置がありましたが、それらも数十時間後には停止をして、その結果14日には3号機がメルトダウンし、さらに水素爆発を起こしました。
At the reactor number 2 and number 3, they had a different system from number 1 reactor in terms of a backup cooling system. Number 1 reactor had the isolation condenser, but they had different system. But those also failed, and reactor number 3 went through melt through on the 14th and also had hydrogen explosion.
そして3月15日には2号機がメルトダウンし、水素爆発をメルトダウンし、格納容器が破壊され、さらに4号機が水素爆発を起こしました。
On the day, on the 15th, reactor number 2 had the meltdown, and the containment vessel broke. At about the same time, reactor number 4 had hydrogen explosion.
つまり地震が来てわずか100時間の間に、4基の原発がメルトダウンや水素爆発を連鎖的に起こすという世界で、初めての、最も厳しい事故に発展しました。
何時間後とおっしゃいました？100時間。
100時間。
Within 100 hours of the earthquake, 4 reactors, one after the other, they basically went through a series of troubles, and this was the first. No such disaster had happened in the world before.
でこうしたシビアアクセントの場合の避難計画というものが我が国でもあらかじめ作られておりました。
Well, in Japan, we had a certain evacuation plan in the case of severe accident.
その計画を作るために原発の比較的近いところに現地対策本部を置くオフサイトセンターというものを設けて、そこに自治体の関係者、そして、政府の関係者が集まって、逃げる範囲を判断することになっておりました。
According to the plan, in the case of accident like that, they were supposed to set up a sort of emergency response room. They call it off-site center, and where the local government and the central government and I guess the technicians all get together and determine the evacuation plan.
しかし地震のために、必要な関係者がその場所に集まることもできなかったし、集まった人も電話や電気が止まっていて、全くその現地対策本部は機能しませんでした。
But what happened was that because of the earthquake, some of those people who were supposed to be there could not be there, and also there were some power outages and phone lines didn't work, and so there were a lot of issues, situations where we hadn't anticipated for such an accident.
その対策本部が置かれた場所は路から5キロのところにありましたので、翌日には避難をその対策本部自身が避難をしなければいけなくなりました。5キロです。
And not only that, this emergency response room was located 5 kilometers from the reactor. So this off-site center itself had to be evacuated.
つまり
eventually.
5キロ以上逃げなければいけないようなシビアアクシデントが起こることは全く予想していなかった。つまりはそれほど大きな原発事故は起こらないという前提で、避難計画も立てられておりました。
This illustrates how we had not anticipated an accident this severe, which would require, 5-kilometer evacuation.
そうした状況の中で、官邸にいた私は専門家を集めて、そこで判断をして、翌日朝には10キロの範囲、さらに翌日の夕方には20キロの範囲までを避難区域として、避難をするように指示をしました。
So we basically managed from Tokyo, where he had his office, and he gathered experts, and they basically dictated the evacuation. So the next day, the evacuation zone was expanded to 10-kilometer zone, and the next day, 20 kilometers.
しかし今考えて、大変残念だと言いましょうか、ことがあります。
But looking back, I have some regrets.
というのは、逃げる範囲を最初考えたのは、格納容器が爆発をしたときに、それによって直接大量の放射能を浴びることがないように、範囲を決めたわけですけれども、しかし実際には格納容器は爆発をしなかったけれども、大量の放射能を含んだ物質が外に出て、それがどの方向に流れたか、これを含めて逃げる範囲や、あるいは要素剤を子どもたちに与えることを考える、その作業が遅れたことが大変残念であります。
My regret is this. Well, we were trying to determine the evacuation zone based on the scenario where containment vessel fails and explodes, and the in a lot of amount of radioactivity would go outside. Well, in reality, containment vessel did not fail. However, a huge amount of plume went outside. And so we were not prepared for this kind of situation, and it wasn't part of our thinking to, say, distribute iodine pills or telling people, direction of plume is this way, so don't go that way. That was not part of our thinking at the time. That thinking came after, and that is my big regret.
子供が放射性物質を吸い込んで甲状腺がんになることを防ぐためには、溶素剤をその前に与えることが効果的だということが分かっております。そして我が国でも各自治体には溶素剤を保管をしておりました。
Well, it is well known that in order to prevent, especially children who are radiosensitive, in order to prevent children from being exposed, it's effective to give up iodine pills before they're exposed. We knew that, and because of that, sort of municipalities in the vicinity, they all had store of iodine pills.
しかし、メルトダウンして放射性物質が外に出るという予測を政府の機関もするのが遅れたために、それを子どもたちに飲ませる指示を結果としては出すことがないままに終わってしまいました。
However, we weren't aware that the radioactivity was going outside because we didn't think that the containment vessel failed yet, and so we weren't thinking that much radioactivity was going inside. So because we misjudged that, we ended up not giving the order of distributing iodine pills in time.
その結果、ごく一部の自治体では自主的な判断で、子どもに溶素剤を飲ませましたけれども、多くの自治体では結果としては間に合った形での溶素剤の投与ができないままに終わりました。
As a result, some towns and villages, municipalities made their own decision to distribute iodine pills, but others did not. And so those iodine pills were basically ended up not being used.
また放射性物質が原子炉から出たときに、気象の関係、風の方向などでどちらにそれが流れていくのかということを予測するスピーディーというソフトを我が国は開発をしておりました。
And we had this system called SPEEDY. I forgot the acronym. I think a system of a plume, basically a simulation model. It's like predicting which direction based on the weather, and it's a simulation model.
しかしこの予測データもいろいろな役所が誰の責任で活用するかということが、きちっと決まっていなかったために、活用するのにかなりの時間がかかって、その結果、一部のところでは、強い放射能が流れた方向に、人々が逃げて、その放射能を浴びたというそういうことも生じてしまいました。
But what happened was there was no sort of oversight. I mean, it was not clear who is in charge of this SPEEDY program, and at the government level. So we ended up not utilizing the data that we had, and as a result, some people ended up running into the direction of the plume.
福島原発事故から2年半経ちましたけれども、我が国では各原発について事故が起きた時の避難計画を自治体などが立てることになっておりますけれども、しかし私の耳に入っている限り、実施可能な避難計画がきちんと立てた自治体は極めて限られております。
Well, I've been talking about Fukushima Daiichi reactor, but if you just look throughout Japan, it is true that each local government are responsible for coming up with the practical evacuation plan. But as far as I can tell, very few local government municipalities have done that.
また我が国でも、このピルグリム原発と同じように、長いこの半島でケープのこのなんて言いましょうか、海に突き出した、ところの根元に伊方原発というのが四国のところにあります。そういった場合は、それより先に住んでいる人たちは、陸上で逃げようと思えば原発に近づいて逃げなければいけなくなる、そういった意味で、特にそういったケープというんでしょうか、その岬の場合の逃げる計画は日本の場合でもまだしっかりと立っておりません。
And I understand that the Pilgrim nuclear power plant is located at the bottom of a peninsula, a jutting out part of the Cape Cod, and there is a similar situation in Japan in an island called Shikoku. It's a southwestern island, and there is a reactor called Ikata nuclear power plant, and they too have a power plant right at the bottom of this peninsula, just small peninsula, and the evacuation plan. Well, in that place, people who are on that peninsula part, if they try to escape on land, they have to go towards the reactor. And how can you avoid that? So there is really no good way evacuation plan in that situation has been made yet to date in Japan.
その後の放射性物質の漏洩も現在、量は少なくなりましたが続いておりまして、それによる影響、あるいは事故直後の影響については、特に子どもについては長期にわたって、健康状態を観察する必要がある、そのことが私にとっても大変、心配なことであります。
So the exposure from the leaked radiation from the accident, well, it's continuing today, maybe to a lesser extent, but still continuing. And the long-term health effects of the radiation, especially for children, is my big concern too.
こうした最初の5日間で、事故が拡大しているときに私が考えたことは、どこまで事故が拡大し、どうすればそれを止めることができるか、このことを必死に考えました。
So during those 5 days after the earthquake, what went through my mind was, how far is this going to affect, and how can we stop this?
その時に頭に浮かんだのは、チェルノブイリの事故のことでありました。
I immediately thought about Chernobyl. Sorry.
チェルノブイリの事故は大変厳しい事故でしたけれども、しかし事故を起こしたのは原発は1基だけです。
in Chernobyl, it was a severe accident, all right, but then it was just one reactor.
で福島原発では第一サイトに6基の原発、そして、7つの使用済み燃料プールがあります。
At Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station, they had 6 reactors and 7 spent fuel pools.
12キロ先の第2サイトにはさらに4基の原発と4個の使用済み燃料プールがあります。
12キロ離れた。
12キロ離れた。
And then 12 kilometers from the Fukushima Daiichi power station, there's a Fukushima Daini, number 2 power station. They have 4 reactors and 4 spent fuel pools.
これらのすべての原発と使用済み燃料プールがコントロールができなくなったときには、チェルノブイリの事故の何十倍あるいは100倍を超える放射性物質が大気中あるいは海水中に放出されてしまうだろう、そのように私は考えました。
I felt that if all these 10 reactors, 11 pools, spent fuel pools, if we lost control over all this, then potentially we will end up having a disaster greater, much, maybe 10 times, maybe more than 100 times greater than Chernobyl accident.
その場合に、東京を含む極めて広い範囲から人々を逃がさなければならなくなるのではないか、このように考えました。
If that happened, then we'll have to evacuate people, including Tokyo, a large amount of people.
その後、専門家に改めてシミュレーションをしてもらいましたが、私が心配したのとほぼ同様に、最悪の場合は福島原発から250キロの範囲、この範囲には5000万人の人が住んでおりますが、この範囲から5000万人の人たちが逃げ出さなければならなくなる、これが最悪のケースとして指摘をされました。
So I tasked an expert to come up with a simulation in a worst case scenario, and his report was that we will have to evacuate up to say 250 kilometers, which is about 150 or so miles, and that includes the greater Tokyo area population of 50 million.
日本はアメリカに比べれば国土も狭いわけですから、そうすると国土の3分の1が人が住めなくなる、そして人口の 40% が住んでいるところから逃げ出さなければならなくなる。これは国としての機能を長期にわたって機能しなくなることを意味しています。
Japan, as you know, is a small country, and if something like that should happen, then a third of the land mass will be affected, and that means 40% of the population will be affected. If that happens, then Japan will lose the function as a nation for a long period of time.
私も3.11 の事故が起きるまでは、安全性を確認して原発を使っていく、そういう立場で、行政に当たっておりました。
Prior to March 11th, 2011, my position as the Prime Minister was to keep using nuclear power by ensuring the safety.
しかし、この福島原発事故に直面しまして、その事故が起きた時の被害の最悪のケースの被害の大きさを知ったときに、事故を起こしてはならない、そして事故を起こさないための唯一の方法は原発を使わないことによるしかない、こういうふうに考え方を180度変えました。
But after the accident, having understood the enormity of the effects, the the result of a severe accident, I realized that in order to ensure that an accident does not happen like this, is not to have a nuclear power plant.
そしてそして同時に原子力発電所がなくても必要なエネルギーを供給できるように、再生可能な自然エネルギーの活用を促進する法律を作りました。
And in order to achieve that, as a step towards that goal, I installed legislation to help increase the renewable energy production.
その法律が施行されて約1年の間に太陽光発電で原発3基分の発電量がすでに生み出されております。
In 1 year after the new legislation, the new solar power generation in Japan increased equivalent of 3 nuclear reactors.
ありがとうございます。そしてある時期までは石油や天然ガスの購入量が増えますけれども、10年ぐらいの間には原発が生み出していた電力はすべて再生可能エネルギーで供給できると考えております。
Well, unfortunately, because in order to replace nuclear power, the use of fossil fuel energy, like gas and oil, gas, it's increasing a little bit in the near future. However, my hope is that in 10 years, maybe we'll be able to replace all the energy that used to be created by nuclear power plant by renewable energy.
そしてさらに、将来2050年頃までには石油や天然ガスといった CO2 を排出する化石燃料を使わないでも、人間があるいは我々が必要とする電気やエネルギーをすべて再生可能な自然エネルギーで供給できると私は世界のそういった技術開発を全部調べておりますけれども、そのことは可能だと確信しております。
Okay, I guess what he said about in 10 years' time, maybe he hoped to replace the nuclear power with maybe still relying on fossil fuel. So what he just said was by year 2050, even that we don't have to rely on those fossil fuel at all, and all Japan's energy needs will be met by renewals alone.
最後にもう一点だけ申し上げて私のお話を終わりたいと思います。
I have one more thing I'd like to say.
今年の6月にカリフォルニアに招かれました。そして今日ご一緒の安子さんたちと一緒にシンポジウムを行いました。
June this year, I was in California and participated in symposium with all these, people, including Dr. Yasuko and everybody here.
その集会の2日後に、エジソン社は、カリフォルニアにあるサンオノフレ原発の廃炉を決定いたしました。
2 days after the symposium, Edison decided to shut down San Onofre nuclear power plant.
もちろんこのことは私たちのシンポジウムも少しはお役に立ったかもしれませんが、それ以上に、その地域に住んでおられる皆さんがそれぞれの州議会、市議会などに働きかけられたその市民の力によるものだとそのように思っております。
Well, maybe the symposium might have had some effect, but more so, more than that, I believe that it was citizens who worked tirelessly in all those years, lobbying their state senators or their municipal government, and it was because of all those citizens they were able to shut down.
昨日はニューヨークでインディアンポイントの原発についてのシンポジウムにも出させていただきました。
Yesterday I was in New York, and we were discussing the Indian Point nuclear power plant.
そして今日のこのボストンにおけるこの会も含めて、最終的に原発の存続か否かを決めるのはそこに住む人々、市民の皆さんの意思だと私は確信しております。
So today, we here today in Boston and with the Pilgrim nuclear power plant, I really believe that ultimately it is up to the citizens to decide whether or not to shut down nuclear power plant.
ぜひ、皆さんの意思で、原発に頼らない、ボストン、アメリカ、日本、そして、原発に頼らない世界を生み出していく。このことは私たちにとっては子どもや孫に対するある意味では義務でもあると、このように考えているということを最後に申し上げて、私のお話を終わりにさせていただきます。
Well, the will of people, that is what changes the world. And here in Japan or United States, it is really up to the people's will to decide, and we owe to the future generations. So this is the end of my
Thank you very
speech.
much.
Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Gregory Yazko, who is the former chairman of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, which oversees the United States nuclear power plants. Mr. Yazko was raised in Albany, New York. He studied both physics and philosophy at Cornell. He also earned a doctorate in physics in 1999. Not long after he received that doctorate, he began working in different advisory and policy roles on Capitol Hill. His work there included advising Congressman Ed Markey, who many of us are familiar with here. Mr. Yazko was first sworn in as a commissioner on the NRC in 2005, and it was 4 years later that President Obama named him to the NRC. I suspect he'll pick up the story from there, and I'm hoping he's a good storyteller because his tenure on the NRC included numerous battles with fellow commissioners. He often was the lone dissenting voice on issues that came before the commission, and his colleagues on the NRC made several attempts to have him removed. All good stuff. When it comes to relicensing the Pilgrim nuclear power station last year, Mr. Yazko again found himself alone, voting against the 20-year license extension. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming former NRC Chairman, Mr. Gregory Yazko.
Well, thank you for that warm introduction. I wasn't going to tell stories, but I'll tell you a quick story from last night. Actually, the last 6 weeks or so that I was in my job after I announced my resignation and then ultimately did leave the agency, it was a very busy time for me, and I'd actually had to be reminded last night that I had opposed the Pilgrim relicensing, not necessarily because I forgot that I opposed it, but I forgot that that decision had happened then because there were so many other things going on. But I was just pulling up some of the record and just refreshing my memory about that last night, and it was a very interesting time at the commission. And I think the Pilgrim relicensing really highlighted a lot of important issues. Clearly here you had a plant that was PWR Mark I, and at the time the agency was trying to really balance this tremendous pressure to kind of do business as usual. And at the same time, we had this pressing reality that business was not usual anymore. And a lot of that kind of came to head with the Pilgrim relicensing. And you had contentions related to post-Fukushima issues. You had really just a number of things that, when you step back and you look at these issues, it really, it seems quite obvious in a lot of ways what we should have done. And that really was to take a pause. You'll hear a little bit later from Peter Bradford, talk about 3 Mile Island and the fact that after 3 Mile Island there was a pause on licensing activity for about 18 months, I think. That simply did not happen. And I think that as I look back was one of the areas where if I could have pushed harder, I would have pushed more for a pause on relicensing, a pause on new licensing activities until we sorted through really what the Fukushima accident meant. And Arnie may not talk about it, but we actually issued the license for Manyankee several days after Fukushima. Now that one was a little bit more complicated because at that time we had formally completed the licensing, and at that point legally they were entitled to a license. So it was to some extent a clerical process to actually issue that license when we did, but it presented an interesting timing, and I think underlying it is really just the fundamental issue that we're dealing with here, which is that nuclear technology is a technology that has, while unlikely, the potential for very catastrophic consequences. And I think you heard the Senator mention that and talk about that very eloquently, that it is a very complicated calculation about risk and consequences, or probability, likelihood, and consequences. If you tend to look strictly in a numerical perspective, what you find is something that looks very, very small. But at the heart of that is actually a very, very significant consequence with a very low likelihood. But the important piece of that, and I think what often gets lost, is there's often a tendency to want to think of low probabilities as things that happen only far, far, far into the future. But it's actually not really what that means. It's really more of a relative comparison of the likelihood of things to happen. If it's a 1 in a million chance that a meteor is going to crash through the roof of this building, and a 1 in 100 chance that a car is going to crash into this building, you would more likely expect that while I'm giving this speech, there's going to be a car rather than a meteor hitting me. But it doesn't mean that I'm going to have to wait and stand here for a million years, although I could talk for that long. It doesn't mean that and in a million years, that meteor would come crashing down into this podium. It's just not what it means. But we tend to want to talk in that way when we talk about these very low probability, high consequence events. That they're, it's a 1 in a million probability, or it's longer, the probability is longer than the lifetime of the Earth. Well, clearly we have data that says that that's simply not true. And it happened. There was a fascinating, and I'll get to my speech after that, but it got me on stories. And there was a staff at the NRC who was one of my favorite staffs, a guy named Mark Cunningham. If you ever have a chance to meet Mark Cunningham, you should meet Mark Cunningham. He was really one of the best that the NRC had. I think he's retired now. But he and I used to prod him constantly. Mark did a lot of things that we did at the NRC dealing with aircraft impact. And one of the most significant accomplishments that I am proud of my time at the NRC was finally convincing Mark to talk about aircraft crashes differently. And Mark was one of the guys who was responsible for figuring out how we're going to deal with protecting nuclear power plants against aircraft crash after September 11th. And Mark was one of our top experts in the use of probabilistic risk assessment. So every time there would be a briefing and Mark would present to us, he would talk about the possibility of aircraft hitting nuclear power plants and doing damage. And he would talk about this issue, and the first point that I would always stress with him is that this was not a random occurrence. So probability is not really relevant when you're talking about intentional actions. So you can't necessarily say, well, you know, the probability is such and such. And he would say, well, you know, actually there were actually studies done. They put pilots and people who had very limited aircraft experience in simulators. And they would have them go out and try and land big jets against targets. This was actually done after September 11th. I think the Department of Homeland Security commissioned the study and did this. So people would get a measure of probability, of what's the likelihood of somebody crashing an aircraft into, you know, into the Capitol, into something other than that. And I would always just say, well, why don't we stop for a second? We know the probability. The probability is 0.75. There were 4 planes on 9/11. 3 of them hit their targets. And, you know, there was a tendency to want to ignore that data and that fact. But that was actually, we have empirical evidence about the ability of somebody who is not well-trained, or well-trained, you can, however you want to say it, but not a commercial airline pilot, let's say, and their ability to take an airplane at high speed and hit a target. And we had that data. But there was a tendency to want to look at this other data that was simulations and scenarios rather than the actual real data. And to some extent, we have that in nuclear, with nuclear power plant accidents as well. And we've had a number of accidents, and Arnie will touch on that, on where that falls in the panoply of the probabilities and likelihoods. So the point is that these probabilities and these likelihoods are useful to make decisions, but they don't tell you when things will happen. And so that's really, in a lot of ways, the biggest challenge we face when we deal with these issues, is how do we think about these low probability, high consequence events? And I think Prime Minister Khan has done an excellent job talking about how that experience changed him and how his views changed on that. And it was very moving for me the first time that I heard him say that and really hear about that. And hear his thoughts. So what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about is how this accident affected, how my views about how this accident affected Japan, the nuclear industry in the United States, and in some ways how we've learned some things from it, and in some ways we simply haven't yet learned what we need to learn. You know, when we talk about the Fukushima accident, I think sometimes it's important to remember what this really was, and this was an earthquake and a tsunami, which was at the heart and at the beginning a tremendous human tragedy. Tens of thousands of people died or were missing at the time, right after the tsunami. And you had this massive wave of water wash in, do tremendous destruction to property, to people, to lives, and then the water receded. And in many ways, you know, the natural thinking of this kind of incident is, well, now we go in and we begin the process of humanitarian assistance and rescue. And the U.S. government was a part of that process, helping our friends and colleagues in Japan to try and recover as many people as possible, to find people who may have been trapped in the rubble. And unfortunately, as that water receded, that wasn't the end of the challenge and the difficulty for people. Because as that water receded, people began to recognize then that it had done some things to a number of nuclear power plants. And now, look in the future, we think and talk about Fukushima Daiichi, but there were a number of other nuclear power plants that were challenged at the time. Fukushima Daini, which was a nearby plant. Onagawa, which was another plant as well. Those were plants that we were all watching because they had all been close to the tsunami wave and had damage and impact. Thankfully, only Daiichi really ultimately progressed into an accident. And this was then a nuclear accident that was unprecedented. It was very, very different from the kinds of things we talked about and think about when we think about nuclear power accident. It was really an accident that for all intents and purposes lasted for 9 months. And it is an incident that will go on for decades. And I'll remember one night I was at the operations center at the NRC, and one of the staff, one of my favorite people at the NRC, right after Mark was, there was another gentleman at the NRC who was one of my favorite. Whenever there was a tough issue, this was the guy who was dealing with a tough issue. And I was always giving him a hard time. Because I was always pushing him, and he would look at me and say, oh gosh, here we go again. But he happened to be with me in the operations center one night, and it happened to be a night in which there was evidence of a significant change in the containment and the pressure vessel in Unit 2 at Fukushima Daiichi. And we were getting information about a loud sound, and then there was associated with that was a pressure drop. So the understanding, the assessment was that they had had a breach of the pressure vessel, or the primary containment structures at the reactor. And I remember this one staff, he sat down in his chair and he sat next to me and he just said to me, he said, you know, this wasn't supposed to happen. This kind of thing is not what was supposed to happen. And this was one of, you know, kind of, and I think of him as kind of one of the crustiest, kind of grumpiest NRC staff people that you would find, but in a good way. I mean, the kind of guy that would look at a problem and want to get to the bottom and do the right thing. And he just sat down in his chair and he just slumped, and he said, this isn't in the playbook anymore. And I think that's a lot of what we saw and what happened with this accident was many things that were just not in the playbook. It was very different. We had 3 reactors to worry about. There were spent fuel pools to worry about. All of this, and with significant releases that were then really for a long time uncertain about how they would be controlled. The Prime Minister has talked eloquently about the efforts that they took to ultimately inject seawater, but there was a lot of discussion about injection of seawater and what that would do. There were people who believed you couldn't do that. If you did that, you would ultimately accumulate salt, like, you know, kind of know the process when you boil, you know, if you boil tea, eventually you're left with kind of calcified material in that teapot. Well, you would do a similar thing to these reactors, and you might actually plug up the channels that are used to send cooling water through the core, and you would make the situation worse. You would make it completely uncoolable. So there was there were just a lot of issues that had to be worked through and discussed and developed. But after 9 months, we got to a place in which fundamentally the reactors had cooled to a level in which really the immediate accident and immediate crisis was over. But that was 9 months later. It was really 9 months of a recurring low-level release of radiation. Something that was really unprecedented in the models and the plans and the way that we think about these kinds of accidents. So it fundamentally challenged a lot of assumptions, a lot of thinking about what a nuclear power plant accident is. One of the first was that you could have severe accidents. And not only that you could have a severe accident, but you could have simultaneously 3 severe accidents. I mean, you know, before that day, if you had asked anyone, no one would have thought of that and said, yeah, of course, you could have a situation in which, you know, multi-unit site will have multiple severe accidents simultaneously. That's something we should be thinking about and planning for, but ultimately it wasn't. The other challenge or myth and assumption that was really challenged was that we could contain the releases. You know, we rely and understand that we have these containment structures. Now, it's known that they, under certain scenarios, can ultimately fail. But the basic belief and understanding and assumption in every decision-making process was that these containment structures would work. You could melt fuel, but radiation wouldn't really leak to the environment in significant quantities to need evacuations or anything like that. I mean, to some extent, that's what happened at 3 Mile Island. Another important idea that was challenged by this accident was that we understood how to control the accumulation of hydrogen. That when hydrogen was produced in a severe accident, that we could control. There were systems, there were methods, there were structures that were intended to prevent hydrogen explosions, and yet we saw 3 hydrogen explosions at Fukushima Daiichi. As Prime Minister Khan talked about, emergency planning was thought to be well understood and well advanced and developed, and we saw challenges. At Fukushima Daiichi with that. He talked about some of those challenges. And finally, it is I think, perhaps hubris that we have, that ultimately we fully understand how Mother Nature will challenge us repeatedly. And that was one of those underlying tragedies and lessons that I think was learned. And this is in a country, certainly of Japan, for which there's tremendous sensitivity to seismic events and earthquakes. In the last 2 years, I've been to Japan, in the last year, really. I've been to Japan twice. Each time I've been to Japan, I've experienced an earthquake. So this is not a country that is unaware of earthquakes, and yet there's always a tendency somehow then to miss those issues and to miss the warning signs and to miss fixing the problems that need to be fixed. But when I think about the accident, the thing that strikes me the most and the issue that is perhaps most significant is simply the human toll this accident took. More than 100,000 people were evacuated. Most, if not all of those people, continue to be out of their homes, away from their communities and their families for what is now over 2 years. I challenge any of you to think about the last time you had to leave your home, maybe because of a hurricane, maybe because of a power outage, and how disruptive to you that was. Now imagine not just being forced out of your home, but away from your community and away from your family. And when I went to Japan in August of 2012, I visited with a family that had been relocated from the site, or from their home. They were living in a temporary housing facility, which was relatively comfortable given the situation. But nonetheless, what struck me the most was a picture on the wall. It was a picture of this man's children and grandchildren. And I asked him, and I said, well, where are those people now? And he said, well, my children, one child is in one place, another child is in another place, and of course with them are their grandchildren. And I said, do you see them much? He said, no, they don't really, we don't see them much anymore. Just think about, for those of you who are blessed to have children and grandchildren, what it's like to have people that you're used to being around as part of your community, as part of your life, and have those people not taken away from you, but have to move and resettle somewhere else to live, to start a new life. So, there's all this talk about, well, we'll do cleanup, we'll bring people back to the community, but that simply the community no longer exists. You can bring people back, but the community is no longer there. Some people will have moved on and have had to move on for new jobs, new life, and then to relocate and uproot those people is simply not feasible and possible. So, it's hard to put those kinds of impacts into formulas and calculations in the analysis and assessment of what this accident means. But ultimately, it is one of the greatest impacts from the accident itself. The numerical kinds of things, the things we know and measure, are easier to talk about. We know there's been significant land contamination. 30% of the electricity, traditional forms of electricity in Japan are no longer operating, the nuclear power plants that provided 30% of their electricity. Those are significant impacts. We think of this impact of this accident impacting the 6-unit site at Fukushima Daiichi, but in fact it's impacted the entire Japanese nuclear power industry. No nuclear power plants are operating right now, and that's a significant impact. There was a study that was done in June of 2012 by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers as they were looking at what does this accident mean. And they came up with an estimate, which I think is probably at this point I would say is an underestimate likely of the impacts, but this is a quote from their report. They said the current rough estimate of the total cost to Japan from the Fukushima Daiichi accident is about $500 billion US. And this is an important caveat, which will substantially increase if nuclear electricity generation continues to be replaced for a long time by other means. And that's certainly the situation we're in now. And so that wasn't a study that was done by an organization that has a particular view about nuclear either for or against. Simply a group of technical experts and engineers who deal with a lot of issues related to nuclear power, but nonetheless don't necessarily have a particular view. So it's a very, very strong statement. So, what is this accident telling us? It's telling us fundamentally that severe accidents have happened and they will happen because of the fundamental design and the way that nuclear reactors are designed in this country. Now, that doesn't mean that Pilgrim is going to have an accident tomorrow or even in my lifetime. But ultimately, we can't for sure rule out the possibility of that happening. And almost anyone in the nuclear industry will tell you that. If you press them hard enough, they will eventually come to that conclusion. And yes, we cannot rule it out. We think it's unlikely. We don't expect it to happen tomorrow, but it's a possibility. And one of the most important things that I have come to realize, and this wasn't something that I determined, but it's what people told me and what society told me, is that society does not accept severe accidents in nuclear power plants. And all you have to do is look at the reaction in this country, look at the reaction in Japan. Clearly, society is saying quite clearly and loudly, this is unacceptable. This cannot happen. So if it's saying that, what do we need to do about it? I mean, how do we address that issue and deal with that issue? Well, I think the fundamental answer is we have to think about safety in a different way. Safety has to mean eliminate the possibility of severe accidents. This is simply an unacceptable, as the senator said, this is an unacceptable consequence. Doesn't matter how low the probability is, it is an unacceptable consequence. So our efforts and our activities need to be about making that an impossibility and getting us to that point. Unfortunately, I think there are some people in the United States and some people in the nuclear power industry who don't want to look at it from that perspective and want to continue to believe that the accidents won't happen, that they can be prevented. And, you know, again, it doesn't mean that every nuclear power plant is going to have an accident, but we can't say with certainty that they won't. So we need to get to a place in which that happens. You know, and there's also, I think, a tendency to want to say, well, this was a Japanese problem. We don't have those kinds of earthquakes in Japan, and that's true. We have different types of earthquakes. We have different types of natural hazards. We have tornadoes in this country. I don't think they have tornadoes in Japan. There are different types of hazards, hurricanes that are very different and unique to this country. And one of the things that was really interesting to me during my time as chairman was that around the time of this accident, there were significant issues with external hazards in the United States. Hazards that Mother Nature presented that were different from how we had expected the plants to be challenged. There was a plant in Nebraska that experienced very significant levels of flooding. And because of some work by NRC staff in the year prior to that, they had made additional protections against that flooding. So these kinds of hazards they're out there. In fact, in Virginia, there was an earthquake that slightly exceeded the design standards for a nuclear power plant that was very close to that earthquake. Now, that plant performed well. The structures held well. But again, it just reinforces that we haven't quite captured all of these issues and how they properly affect the facilities that use nuclear power. So, you know, when I think about the kinds of things, and I look back on the time when I was chairman, the kinds of things that were done, you know, in a lot of ways there was some very tremendous work that was done to look at and study the accident, but there wasn't really enough that was done to actually implement those kinds of lessons that were learned from the accident. And one of the, as I mentioned, one of the biggest issues that really happened was that there was no real effort to say we need to take a pause on new licensing and relicensing. That simply was not something that was in scope of the conversation at that time. And looking back, that's one of those things that I think is obviously very odd. But I think the NRC did a lot of good things. There was a report that was done that came up with 12 high-level recommendations for how to improve nuclear power plant safety in this country. The challenge, of course, though, is, and one of my predecessors on the NRC used to say this, Dale Klein, quite a bit, that the issue isn't learning lessons, it's lessons implemented. You know, we talk a lot about that. It's the lessons learned. Well, it's not the lessons learned, it's the lessons implemented. And I think the NRC did a good job of identifying the lessons learned. I'm not sure that the industry and the agency has done a good enough job implementing those lessons. You know, they covered some of the most significant issues, the station blackout, so the total loss of electric power, the issue that ultimately damaged the plant and plagued the plant itself. And then, of course, the kinds of understanding of natural hazards, seismic events, flooding events, the kinds of things that can lead you to a situation in which you would lose all your off-site power or all your electrical power distribution. So I want to just highlight where we stand on a number of these issues. Probably I'll highlight two of the most significant ones. One of the biggest issues, of course, is understanding earthquakes and understanding how these earthquakes affect nuclear power plants. Before the incident in Fukushima, we were beginning to understand and reevaluate how earthquakes affect structures in the central and eastern part of the United States. So the NRC, working with other federal agencies, had already begun to re-examine that process. And it was clear that our previous understanding of earthquakes was limited. It wasn't quite accurate enough, and it didn't quite describe how these earthquakes happened on the East Coast, mostly because it was based on West Coast earthquakes, which happen very different because the geography is very different on the West Coast than it is here on the East Coast. So the NRC was in the process of looking at and developing a new methodology. Once the earthquake happened, it was clear that we needed to accelerate that activity. And that was one of the recommendations of the task force, was to get on the process of re-examining how we deal with seismic events. When I was at the commission and all of these issues were raised, I challenged the industry and I challenged the agency to complete all of these activities, including whatever changes needed to be made to the plants within 5 years. I mean, I think that, it sounds like, and I would go up and talk to senators and they'd say, 5 years, are you kidding me? I'd say, well, look, that's light speed at the NRC. So let's put some perspective here. But it is a challenge, and it is some time that we need to do this, to really do the technical work, to make the changes that we need to make. Well, before I came and gave this talk, I went to see what the status of these seismic modifications were. And in spring of this year, the industry proposed a new schedule and a new timeline for going about doing these modifications. And the current timeline, and the interesting caveat of this is it's not even using the new updated, more advanced methodology. It's using a different type of methodology that's a simpler methodology. And under this new schedule, plants will be given up until December of 2016 to make modifications to their facilities, and modifications that don't require an outage. The plants will then be given up to 2 outages to complete additional modifications that would necessitate being done during an outage. So that's another, depending on the cycle, which is usually 18 to 24 months for an outage at a nuclear power plant, that's anywhere from 3 to 4 years. So we're looking at anywhere between December 2017 to December 2018, assuming everything goes well, and my experience has been generally that these things never work the way they will, and there's always delays, and there's always additional time. So at the earliest, you're looking at modifications being completed by December 2017 or December 2018, more than 6 to 7 years after the accident. And what is arguably the most important issue coming out of the accident. Going back to this more sophisticated analysis for an industry that wants to proclaim that it is technologically sophisticated, technologically adept, the much more sophisticated probabilistic risk-type assessments of earthquake, which in the end are much better approaches to dealing with this, many of those analyses won't even be done until 2020. And I just would ask myself as chairman when I would see these kind of, and I wasn't seeing these timelines then, they were much shorter. But when I see these things, I just ask myself, what are we doing as an industry? What are we doing as a technology when we can't solve a problem like seismic understanding in nuclear power plants in less than 10 years? I mean, that simply, again, should not be acceptable to anyone in the industry. It shouldn't be acceptable to any member of the public, and it shouldn't be acceptable to the regulator. It's not good business practice. I mean, could you imagine, an airline saying we're going to take another 10 years to deal with an issue, or a car company saying we're going to take another 10 years, to deal with this issue? When Toyota had their brake recall, could you imagine if they were still today fixing that brake issue? That would just be unacceptable. So, I think there's still a lot of work to do to get these issues in the right place and where they need to be. So just looking at where we are kind of right now in the present, clearly at Fukushima, as I said, the immediate accident is over. It ended really kind of by and large in December of 2011, but there's still a tremendous effort and a tremendous incident going on, a contamination event at that site. You've got challenges with water infiltrating the site. You've got challenges with contaminated water needing to be stored at the site. And ultimately, you have to have a continued cooling for these reactors. I think in the last several weeks, you've seen a greater government intervention, a greater government activity in Japan to try and bring this situation better under control. But I think, if nothing else, some of these leaks have at least reawakened awareness and understanding that this incident is not over. It is not going to be over for decades, and that you can't stress that enough. Looking at the United States, where we stand, it was a very interesting time, I think, in the nuclear industry. We're at a period in which there's been a contraction in the nuclear fleet, really, for the first time in a long time. And what's interesting about that is, generally the expectations have been that economics will drive nuclear power plants to shut down. And I think by and large, for a number of the planned and existing plant shutdowns, that is a primary factor. Oyster Creek, a plant in New Jersey, has announced that they would, years ago, they announced that they would shut down earlier than their allowed license, extended license would allow. Kewanee, a plant in Wisconsin, could not find a buyer, so shut down. Vermont Yankee announced that they'll be shutting down next year. We were up in New York. But what I think is really interesting is that 3 units have shut down in the last year because of safety problems. And those are the things that I think are most of concern and should be most concern. We had 3 plants, a plant in Florida, Crystal River, which through a planned equipment replacement had to cut a hole in their concrete containment structure, and as a result they essentially damaged the entire concrete containment structure. They tried multiple times to repair that and were unsuccessful and had to shut the plant down for what should have been a routine maintenance activity that was just completely misunderstood. And that's a multi-billion-dollar asset that was lost. So regardless of what you think about nuclear power, when you think about it in terms of that is a multi-billion-dollar asset that has now had to be shut down because of improper work planning, improper understanding of how to properly do this containment retrofit. Tell a brief story about this. When I was chairman, the utility that operated Crystal River came to me. They were also in the process of doing a relicensing. And they came to me and they said they wanted their license extended. They did not, unlike Pilgrim, there was no hearing associated with that license extension, so it was kind of the more defined NRC review that was involved in that license renewal process. And the utility chief came to me and said, we want our license extension. You can put a condition in the license that says, we won't, we'll have to repair the containment before we actually, operate or whatever. And I said, well, why would I do that? I said, if you can't fix your containment, you can't operate your plant today, why would I say that you'd be able to operate in another 20 years? And they said, well, we need the license extension to be able to make, an argument, ultimately that we will generate additional revenue that will then pay for us to repair the containment structure. And I said, so what you're asking me is, you're asking me to take a significant financial investment on your part, a risk that your shareholders would have to make about whether or not they want to go forward with this without the license extension. And I said, you're asking me to shift that to the NRC. So you want to go on and make the $2 billion investment, which is what that containment repair would cost, approximately $1 to $2 billion. You want to go make that investment and then put the burden on me to then say that it wasn't done well enough and now you can't operate. But I would have already given you the license to do that said that, ultimately your plant is safe. I said that puts the burden ultimately on an inspector at the NRC for what really is a burden that should be borne by the shareholders of your utility. Because it's your choice to decide whether you want to make that financial risk. And I had a member from the NRC staff there who was the guy responsible for license rules. And afterwards he came up to me and said, thank you. We didn't know what to do with that pressure. And sure enough, we didn't proceed with the license renewal, and sure enough, they decided ultimately they weren't going to risk another $1 to $2 billion to try again and replace the containment structure. And as a result, the plant is shut down today. So, as we think about this, and we think then ultimately about where we are today in nuclear and where this will go into the future, I had a chance to be in Japan with Prime Minister Khan and others, and I had an opportunity to give a talk to some people in Japan. And one of the things that I challenged them was to think about their future. and to think about a future that doesn't necessarily rely on nuclear power, and to think about the kinds of things that they can do to get there. I don't personally believe that we can just shut down plants immediately in this country. There needs to be a phase out, there needs to be a plan to ultimately replace these with other types of generating facilities. But I think that's something we need to think about and something we need to begin doing. And I challenge the people in Japan to put their resources and their technology and their efforts into coming up with the next generation of energy technologies that won't have the potential to contaminate the amount of land that was contaminated at Fukushima, that won't have the potential to evacuate people for 10, 20 years, or even 3 months. And if you think of it that way, why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we? There simply has to be a better way. And I think it's the same kind of challenge that we have to look for in this country. We have tremendous capabilities when we set our minds to it. And when we look at nuclear power plants, and I talked about Indian Point yesterday, and I said, look, the thing that makes the most sense, the sensible, rational thing to do is for Entergy to sit down with the state, with all the elected officials who are opposed to that site, and work out a reasonable way to end the operation of Indian Point. Maybe it's 3 years of operation, maybe it's 4. There are people there who have jobs. You want to find good jobs for those people. You need to replace that power. You want to find good replacement power. Sit down and do that rather than spending years and years and years and years in acrimonious litigation that ultimately leaves all parties dissatisfied. Even the utility at the end of the day doesn't want to go through that. And that's what we saw at Vermont Yankee, is at the end of the day, they got through the litigation, won all the litigation they wanted to win, and then they announced that they were shutting down. And they likely were, I'm guessing here, but were probably prepared to do that earlier, but simply didn't want to leave the litigation hanging and have a precedent set that could be used by for other nuclear power plants. So they spent all that money to go through litigation to ultimately then shut down a plant that really wasn't economically viable. That to me seems like a needless waste of resources and energy. So, I'm certainly encouraged by the kind of involvement I see here, by the Senator's work to raise awareness on these issues, by Prime Minister Khan's efforts, and Arnie's and Pete's to bring a dialogue about thinking about the future in a better way. And I hope at the end of the day that that's what we'll see is a future that if we have nuclear, it's nuclear that doesn't pose the threat of severe accidents, or it's a future in which we don't have nuclear, but we have viable electricity and energy generation that is environmentally sustainable, that meets all the kinds of goals that we should demand and expect from this type of technology. So I thank you for your attention, and be happy to answer questions later. Thank you.
Okay, now we'll introduce Arnie Gunderson, who's the Chief Engineer for Fair Winds Energy Education, which is based in Burlington, Vermont. The group focuses on nuclear power and energy issues. Mr. Gunderson is well known in the nuclear industry. He's been working on issues related to nuclear power for more than 40 years, and much of that work is centered on the Mark I reactors, like the reactor at the Pilgrim Nuclear Power Plant, and as you may know, some of the reactors at Fukushima. So Mr. Gunderson knows the history of the Mark I, and he has some strong opinions on their continued use. Mr. Gunderson is probably best known as a whistleblower, and maybe he'll mention what he found in an accounting safe at one of the businesses he worked at before he was, as he says, blacklisted by the industry. Folks, please welcome Arnie Gunderson.
Hi. I've been told by the translators that I need to get these up a little bit further. Before I start with my remarks, I wanted to thank the Samuel Lawrence Foundation for putting this together, and also the dozens of other people here in Massachusetts who worked so hard to make this event possible. The names would go on for 5 minutes here, but there's a lot of people who worked very hard, and I'm very grateful that they did that. The other thing the other group I'd like to thank is half a world away. We would have had 10 meltdowns at Fukushima Daiichi 6 and at Fukushima Daini 4, were it not for the efforts of a couple hundred Japanese technicians. And they are my personal heroes. You know, they risk their lives, and really it's a triumph of human courage over technology at Daiichi and Daini. And I hope at the end of the day that there'll be a statue to those brave people who stayed behind and fought the nuclear fires and saved Japan and likely saved a large part of the Northern Hemisphere as well. Okay. You know, today's gathering wouldn't be necessary if federal policymakers and state policymakers and business executives really watched television and saw Fukushima Daiichi and really believed what they saw on TV. That if they watched it and if they understood the takeaway, the ultimate takeaway is that accidents happen. That nuclear accidents are inevitable. I like to say, and I've been saying it for years, you know, sooner or later in any foolproof system, the fools are going to exceed the proofs. Well, Pilgrim presents an interesting dichotomy. You know, we've got the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that says that the chance of a meltdown is around 1 in a million. Well, there's 400 plants working roughly, and I'll use some round numbers here. If you put 1 million in the numerator and 400 in the denominator, you wind up with the chance of a meltdown being something on the order of every 2,000, 2,500 years. So if 400 plants had started when the Parthenon was built, we should have just had our first meltdown if you use this technique. The technique is called probabilistic risk assessment, PRA, and I like to call it PRAY. Interestingly, old plants like Pilgrim, the numbers are to justify Pilgrim's going forward, and it's one of the oldest plants in the country, are based on the historical data from newer power plants. It's sort of like me going to my doctor. I'm 64, and the doctor says, well, you could live to 100 based on the historical data from a bunch of 25-year-olds. That's what we're doing when we look at these power plants, the old power plants, the Indian Points, the Pilgrims. We're looking at, we're basing our judgments moving forward on failure rate data from plants that are much younger than Pilgrim. We're forgetting what technicians call the bathtub curve, that as we get old, things wear out. Those numbers aren't rolled into these probabilistic risk assessments. Well, if you believe PRA, then you're going to come to the conclusion that to have 3 meltdowns, the chances are 1 in a million times 1 in a million times 1 in a million. And that's a 1 with 18 zeros behind it to 1 kind of an odds. So that's what the numbers tell us. But that's not what really happened in real life. We've had 5 meltdowns in 35 years. We've had 3 Mile Island, we've had Chernobyl, and we've had 3 meltdowns at Fukushima Daiichi. So if you do the math there, you put 35 on the top and 5 on the bottom, you wind up with about a meltdown every 7 years, maybe once a decade. And I'm not including Windscale and Santa Susana and about 10 other meltdowns that occurred before that in that statistic. So the real numbers show about a once in a decade, once in 7-year frequency. But policymakers and businesses are going forward believing that the chances are 1 in a million. The industry is demanding that you and I foot the bill for their insurance through Price Anderson, which basically means that they're off the hook if there's a big accident. But at the same time, they're telling us that an accident can't happen here. You know, our takeaway is that nuclear power is safe. It's not going to happen at Pilgrim, and therefore don't worry about it. Well, the people that are telling us not to worry about it are also the same ones that are lobbying Congress that we as taxpayers should pay their insurance. There's a fundamental problem with that. It's actually, the psychologists have a name for this. When someone's brain reasons a way to justify support for what the person wants to be true, that's called motivated reasoning. There's a lot of motivated reasoning in the nuclear industry. I was in Canada about 2 months ago, speaking to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, the equivalent of the NRC here, on the Pickering nuclear reactors, because they wanted to extend their life beyond what they were designed for. Pickering has 8 nuclear reactors, and they're located 20 miles from downtown Toronto. At the hearing, speaker after speaker implored the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission to allow the plants to move forward. And the logic was that the plant paid its taxes and was a major employer. And speaker after speaker said that they knew these people that worked at the plant. They were great employees. They lived in the town. They were on the school board. They sang in the church choir. They coached the soccer team. And the position of the speakers before me was that basically good people could tell if their plant was safe or not. And if anything, history tells us that that's not true. It reminds me a little bit of Garrison Keillor and Lake Wobegon. If you recall, he says at Lake Wobegon, all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average. Well, I go to power plant after power plant town, and everybody believes that their power plant's better than average because those nice people that work there couldn't possibly have an accident. Well, if history's taught us anything, it's that nuclear accidents happen despite the best intentions of men and women who work there. I knew the operators at 3 Mile Island. I had a group of people working for me on the recovery efforts, and because of that, I got to know the operators, some of them, and they were great people. They were committed to safety. They were smart, and they lived right in the town. And yet an accident happened. Nuclear power is a technology that can have 40 great years to be wiped out by one bad day. After the Chernobyl accident, I got to meet some of the Chernobyl operators. It's the same story. They were brilliant engineers. They were safety conscious. They lived in the same town. And yet an accident happened. Many great years of operation wiped out by one bad day. I wrote a book called Fukushima Daiichi, The Truth and the Future in Japan, and after that I got to meet some of the operators on Fukushima Daiichi. And just like TMI and just like Chernobyl, they were meticulous, and they knew their plant inside out, and they lived in town, and their families lived in town, and yet an accident happened. You can have 40 good years in one very, very bad day. It's not about the people that work there. It's about a technology that most of the time runs very, very well, and periodically doesn't. Well, companies like Entergy claim that their nuclear power plants are safe. What does it mean to be safe? To Entergy, it means that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has reviewed, in congressional testimony, the NRC has already admitted that they review about 5% of the paper that goes into running a nuclear power plant, no more than 5%. What also happens, though, is that the companies that run nuclear power fund a lobbying group called NEI, the Nuclear Energy Institute, that vets the commissioners before they're approved by Congress. So we've got commissioners that are essentially approved by the nuclear industry, largely, with at least 2 notable exceptions here on my right, that are then setting the standard for the staff at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to move forward. And in addition, that same lobbying company lobbies and works with the NRC to write the regulations under which the plant runs. So when you hear Entergy say the plant is safe, what that really means is that a plant like Pilgrim complies with the minimum acceptable criteria established by a compliant regulator. Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about the corporations that run these plants. In the last 15 years, the NRC has allowed most of these plants to become LLCs. That stands for a limited liability corporation. What an LLC is, it's a separate corporate entity that then funnels money up into a larger corporate entity. So Pilgrim is its own LLC. We talk about Entergy runs Pilgrim. Well, if you look on their corporate charts, it's a Pilgrim LLC. Vermont Yankee is an LLC. Indian Point 2 is an LLC, and separate from it is Indian Point 3, its own LLC. Well, why should that be a concern to us? This structure is put in place to protect the parent company in case one of those LLCs blows a tire. If the LLC releases an enormous amount of radiation, all the other power plants continue to funnel money up to the corporation, but the liability is left with the power plant that released the radiation. It allows a company to declare bankruptcy and move along with the remaining power plants still functioning without having to pay for the cleanup. Now, Entergy wouldn't do that, would they? Actually, they have already. If you look at Entergy's history after Katrina, they had a subsidiary that wasn't a power plant. It was the power company that provided electricity for the city of New Orleans. And it was its own LLC. Well, after Katrina, while people were bailing out the city, Entergy declared bankruptcy of its LLC, Entergy New Orleans, and walked away from its responsibilities. They bailed on the city of New Orleans while New Orleans was bailing itself out. What happened then was the United States government moved cash that it had destined to help the poor people in New Orleans through community development block grants and gave that money to Entergy instead. And Entergy gave its executives bonuses. Well, there's been a couple of organizations that have looked at Entergy to try to get an idea of how well it's funding its reactors. One was an Entergy group itself, 12 hand-picked experts from the nuclear industry. Entergy had take a look at Indian Point 2 and Indian Point 3. And this is from their report. You can get it online. This is their quote. "The physical condition of the plant is visibly deficient. The care and maintenance of some plant systems and structures do not meet the standards of high-performing plants. It is the panel's view that the maintenance and preservation of non-critical plant systems, equipment, and structures is important because it communicates to the employees and the public alike the owner and operator's commitment and professionalism." So Entergy's own hand-picked team of 12 people said they weren't spending enough money on the power plant. Well, in Vermont, Peter and I were on a 5-person expert panel, and we came to some conclusions as well. The Indian Point panel was in 2008, the Vermont panel was in 2010. Here's what we had to say. The issue of inadequate application of resources, that means they're not spending enough money, but we were an expert panel, we had to use big words. The issue of inadequate application of resources takes on heightened importance, giving Entergy's status as an aging plant. Over the remainder of Entergy's operating life, the possibility of a shutdown within a few years can never be ruled out and will become a near certainty at some point. If the events of the last few years are any guide, Entergy has a tendency to focus expenditure on safety systems and systems that have obvious reliability importance while withholding resources for systems that it deems of secondary reliability. Quote, "Limited resource allocation for non-safety systems might therefore be systemic within Entergy." Well, what did Entergy do about recommendations of 2 panels? 2 months ago, they decided they were going to cut their staff by 5% at their nuclear power plants. Now, I think it's important to say, well, what did the NRC do about that? Well, here's the NRC's quote. The answer is the NRC did nothing. The NRC's quote, Neil Sheehan, their public relations person, said, "The NRC has the ability to determine whether there are any adverse impacts through our reactor oversight process. We observe any negative trends via inspection findings or performance indicators, and we could determine if there's any linkage to human resource changes." Well, to me, what that means is that after there's an accident, the NRC can move in and say, well, maybe you didn't have enough people running that plant. You know, the trend here is that the plants are getting older, and instead of having more people working on them, we're cutting the staffs instead. This trend is industry-wide, and it's not just at Entergy. At Millstone, the company that owned it wanted to reduce its staffs as well. And it said that the reason it was doing it was to reduce its staff to approach the industry average. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission did nothing about that. But think about that. Now, if Millstone was above average and was allowed to move toward average, there's got to be a power plant on the other side that was below average that should be forced up to the average. But it's a ratchet that only turns one way. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission always allows these guys to reduce their staffs and never forces them to increase their staffs. Every day at Fairwinds Energy, we get notes, emails that say, how do American plants, how does Pilgrim, how does Vermont Yankee compare to Fukushima Daiichi? Is Pilgrim really any different than Fukushima Daiichi? And the answer is no. In a lot of ways, it's actually worse. And I wanted to touch on a couple of those ways before ending today. First is the reactor at Pilgrim is identical to Fukushima Daiichi Unit 2 and Unit 3. And actually, in a critical way, it's actually worse. And that's the issue of spent fuel. In America, we have filled our fuel pools chock-a-block full. In Japan, they didn't do that. The Japanese had about 7 or 8 years of nuclear fuel in the fuel pools at Daiichi, in each of the fuel pools at Daiichi. Well, we've got 35 years of fuel sitting in the fuel pool at Pilgrim. And if you recall back when the accident started, it was concerns about Unit 4's fuel pool that were dominant in decision makers thinking about evacuations. The fuel pool is what sits on top of the building and is unprotected. Essentially, it's a shed you could buy at Sears. And if the fuel were to be damaged at Pilgrim, there's enough nuclear material there that's equivalent to all 700 bombs that have been exploded in the atmosphere and all of the atmospheric testing that ever occurred. And it's sitting in the pool at Pilgrim. I think one lesson here is that we should do what the Japanese did and get that stuff into dry cask storage just as quickly as possible. Another major difference where the Americans are worse than the Japanese, and Pilgrim is worse, is in emergency planning. The Japanese, before the accident, I think if you asked people what country in the world did evacuation planning and emergency planning best, they would have said the Japanese, because the Japanese have a lot of earthquakes. They really believe in the need to train. And yet, when the earthquake and radiation hit, the emergency plans collapsed completely. Well, Pilgrim's actually worse because the Cape cannot be evacuated. It forces people to head in toward the accident in order to get off the Cape. At Daiichi, you could go inland, but here, anybody who's on the Cape is either trapped on the Cape or forced to move into the radiation plume in order to get out. So evacuation planning at Pilgrim is much worse than what we experienced at Fukushima Daiichi. The other thing is I'd like to talk a little bit about filtered vents. It's a technical, geeky topic, and I won't go into it too much. But containments are meant to contain. But this Mark I design that's at Pilgrim and was at Daiichi is too small. And engineers have known that since at least the late 70s. And in the process of trying to allow the plant to continue to operate, they drilled a hole in the side of the containment to let the radiation out. So to my way of thinking, there's a problem there. Containment's meant to contain, and here you are, in order to save the container, you're drilling a hole in the side of it to let the gases out. All of the plants in Japan, if they're going to start back up, are required to put a hardened filter vent on that hole. And that also holds true for Europe. So for the reactors of this type, these GE Mark I reactors like you have at Pilgrim, in Europe and in Japan, you're required to have a hardened filtered vent. Now the NRC staff came to that exact same conclusion, that one of the Fukushima Daiichi modifications should be to have a hardened filtered vent. They were overruled by the commissioners. So the commissioners picked by Congress basically made an economic decision that the risk to you and I is not worth the expense that Entergy would have to make to put it into Pilgrim. It's a purely economic decision on risk versus benefit. You know, when I was in Tokyo in February last year, 2012, and Tokyo is about 120 miles, depending on where it's a big city, depending on where you are, 150 miles from the accident. And the I was on a book tour for the book we wrote, and I had some sample bags, and every day I made a point of scooping up some dirt at some place in Tokyo, a playground right across from their major legislative, judicial center. On the roof of my publishers, they had a little garden there. I scooped some dirt up there. Every one of those 5 samples qualifies as radioactive waste here in the United States. And they're 120 miles away. Think about, your Boston's 30 miles, depending on where you are, 40 miles away. And we have contaminated a city the size of Tokyo. And I had 5 samples, 5 out of 5 qualified as radioactive waste if they were in America. Another issue, I guess, on emergency planning. Well, 2, to sum it up, is everybody knows, the common thought is that Fukushima Daiichi was caused by a tsunami and an earthquake followed by a tsunami. That's sort of the party line. But what really caused the accident at Fukushima Daiichi was the earthquake knocked down the power lines. And we have a term for that, loss of off-site power, loop. And then the tsunami came in and destroyed the pumps along the water. And that's called loss of the ultimate heat sink, Lewis. It wasn't that the tsunami knocked out the diesels. They did get wiped out, but even if they hadn't been wiped out, they couldn't have been cooled because the pumps along the water that cool the diesels had failed. So that led to something called the station blackout, and the station only has batteries for about 4 hours. And when the batteries died, there was no way to cool the plant. Well, could that happen at Pilgrim? The answer is absolutely yes. Two terrorists working in conjunction could cause that identical accident at Pilgrim. One terrorist with a high-powered rifle could take out the transmission lines coming in from the land side, and another terrorist with a boat loaded with explosives could hit the intake structure and destroy the ultimate heat sink. It almost happened. A couple years ago, you had a Norwegian sailboat in the dark, run out of power, see the lights of Pilgrim, and float up next to the intake structure. And Entergy didn't know it was there until the sun rose the next morning. Now, if that wasn't peace-loving Norwegians and had been Tim McVeigh, it would have been an entirely different outcome. So, can you have an accident with the consequences of Fukushima Daiichi? The answer is yes. And finally, as earthquakes, one of the biggest earthquakes in American history was at Cape Ann, which is right off the coast here in Boston, and totally knocked down the city of Boston back in 1730 or something like that. Of course, the structures were a little weaker then than they are now, but literally one of the biggest earthquakes in American history was off of Cape Ann. We had an earthquake on the East Coast, again, very near the North Anna plant a couple years ago, and I understand it was felt here in Boston. We felt it in Vermont. And there's a lesson to be taken from the North Anna earthquake, and that's that the North Anna was designed for a Richter 6 earthquake. And North Anna had a Richter 6 earthquake, and it survived it, which you got to expect. I mean, they built the plant and it met what it was designed for. But the design basis accident, the worst earthquake they thought would hit North Anna was a 6. And they thought that was once in 1,000, once in 10,000 years. And it happened in 30. So our ability to analyze the magnitude of an earthquake and then build our plants to withstand them, I think was clearly shown to be faulty in the North Anna case. And as Chairman Yasko said, we're working our way through that, but it's a 10-year process to reevaluate how serious an accident a plant needs to withstand. And right now, we're way under designed. Well, let me sum things up. It's easy for the nuclear industry to allow arrogance and hubris to set in. When you look at the sheer size of a nuclear power plant, now I started my career on Millstone 1, which is a sister plant to Pilgrim. Started a year before Pilgrim and a year before Vermont Yankee, and it's an impressive facility to see. And I think then, as now, we have to ask ourselves, and we never do, why does it have to be that impressive? What is inside it that we have to build such an impressive structure to keep that thing from getting out? We're kind of lulled into a sense of hubris, that man can beat nature when you look at the size of these things, and we're forgetting the beast that's inside them and the consequences if it ever gets out. Well, we've seen with Fukushima Daiichi firsthand that nuclear systems can fail with catastrophic results. Now we need to ask ourselves, why should we build such an uncontrollable and unmanageable technology? The forces within these plants are enormous, and they must always be contained 24/7, 365. Well, Fukushima Daiichi, Chernobyl, and TMI all proved how utterly impossible it is to control these forces 24/7, 365. One operator error, one significant weather event, one earthquake, or one terrorist strike, and all of Boston will experience that one bad day. And like Japan, it's going to be one very sad day too. Thank you.
Okay, now we welcome Mr. Peter Bradford, who also served on the NRC. He's the former chairman of Maine and New York Utility Commissions. He teaches at the Environmental Law Center at the Vermont Law School. And just a few more words about Mr. Bradford. He's a 1964 graduate of Yale University. He received a law degree at Yale as well. During the 60s and the 70s, Mr. Bradford was an advisor to the governor of Maine on utility issues and the environment. So he was sworn in and on to the NRC in 1977 after being nominated by President Carter, and it was during his tenure on the board that the partial meltdown occurred at the 3 Mile Island. Over the years, Mr. Bradford has participated on panels and in writing numerous papers attempting to learn lessons from that nuclear accident. Today, 34 years after 3 Mile Island, Mr. Bradford joins us to talk about the lessons learned from yet another accident, the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Please join me in welcoming former NRC Commissioner Peter Bradford.
Let me just see if I actually know how to control this thing. Uh-oh. So there's something humbling about standing up to speak several minutes after the conference program says that you finished. And if it weren't for the fact that, unlike my PowerPoint challenged colleagues, I've actually got a presentation that you'll be able to see, you wouldn't know how much I'm going to drop out in order to try to salvage something of the schedule. I will, in fact, go through this in a way that skips over some parts of it, but any of you who want to obtain the presentation, just let me know afterwards and I can send it to you. There's also a challenge for someone named Bradford talking essentially about a venue called Plymouth, and having the topic be a pilgrim. You can't really say anything too bad about a pilgrim in that. If you start from that background, especially an elderly pilgrim. And in fact, most of my presentation in any case is about the safety and economic regulatory framework that's applicable to a great many, probably all U.S. nuclear plants. You don't really have to believe anything very negative about the folks who operate the Pilgrim unit or other nuclear units to be concerned about this framework. You don't have to believe anything very negative about the people who work at the NRC, most of whom are professionally capable and very dedicated to their jobs. You do have to accept a concern that I think both Arnie and Greg have voiced in the past, namely that the industry has too much of a voice in the selection of NRC commissioners, and that we've reached a sort of tipping point in our campaign finance system such that that voice is not likely to diminish in the future. I wanted also just to say a word about the 3 Mile Island accident before I get into discussing it more systemically, because I was indeed on the commission at that time. It was a great many decades ago. I was more or less Greg's age, had something like Greg's waistline, something like Prime Minister Khan's hairline, and this helps to underline the points that Senator Wolf made at the beginning about the aging process. There was a young woman a while ago taking pictures down here in a deep knee bend. I couldn't possibly get into that bend, or if I did, I'd never get out of it. So it is true that 40 years makes a difference in how well, how capably things operate. And of course, you can replace parts. I have. But it doesn't mean that the age of these units isn't a serious concern from a safety standpoint, but also, as we'll see, from an economic standpoint. And what we're really seeing about nuclear units around the country now is that the economic forces are at least as important, and in some ways interplay with the safety forces in determining how long they actually operate. So this first slide, essentially, if you absorb it, you'll have absorbed all the conclusions I'm going to offer you anyway. The rest of the presentation is all reasoning. The conclusions are that even though the NRC has done a lot in the context of Fukushima, if you look at what it did and what the US government as a whole did after the 3 Mile Island accident, you'll see that it hasn't really done what it would in other contexts refer to as a root cause analysis. Sorry. The term root cause analysis is more or less what you would expect. It's the kind of analysis that doesn't just look at what's wrong, but really tries to understand how it went wrong, what you have to change to make sure that similar things in other contexts don't go wrong in the future. The second conclusion is that the phenomenon 10 years ago, exuberantly called a nuclear renaissance, has now become, in part because that term, in fact, has some of the same resonance as the too cheap to meter phrase that the industry has for many years regretted that Lewis Strauss, then the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, ever uttered in the mid-1950s. It's taken on the characteristics of a bubble, and we'll take a quick look at that as well. And then the final point, one hears a lot to the effect that yes, nuclear power has its shortcomings, but we have to push it forward, have to subsidize it to whatever extent is necessary, because it's a low-carbon energy source, and we will not be able successfully to combat climate change without it. And I want to suggest to you that that's a fallacious way of looking at nuclear power's role in the climate picture as well, and that we need, in fact, to be preparing for the possibility that we're going to see a lot more reactor shutdowns, and that our climate strategy needs to include doing without nuclear energy, which in fact we can do as long as we're prepared for that eventuality. Okay, so sort of a quick tour of the post-3 Mile Island assessments done by the U.S. government. Start with the realization that 3 Mile Island was a much less serious accident than Fukushima and was essentially over in 5 days. There was a limited evacuation, but everyone was able to return to their homes quite quickly. Nonetheless, it was followed by the closing of all 10, I believe, Babcock and Wilcox reactors for a period of several months, during which the NRC undertook to determine that there was little or no likelihood that the chain of events that led to the 3 Mile Island accident could be replicated elsewhere. And the companion reaction to 3 Mile Island 2, the unit that had the accident, was closed for 5 years, during which the NRC completely re-examined and overhauled the capability of that licensee in order to be sure that it could run that unit in the future. And in addition, and Greg alluded to this, there was a moratorium on any licensing actions for new reactors for about 18 months, during which the NRC devoted all of its attention to learning the lessons of 3 Mile Island. Now, on top of that, President Carter appointed a presidential commission. Some of you may recall the term the Kemeny Commission, which worked for a year and had a comprehensive mandate to look at all aspects of the nuclear industry and nuclear regulation and reach its conclusions. The NRC itself agreed that no one was going to consider it a credible accident investigator unless it set up a genuinely independent investigation of its own. So we appointed a special inquiry group, a law firm, that conducted a no-holds-barred investigation of the quality of nuclear regulation. Congress conducted 2 investigations of its own. The end result was an action plan of about 180 items that involved a top-to-bottom review of nuclear regulation. And the Kemeny Commission made a number of more fundamental suggestions about the structure of the industry and the regulatory process. Even then, arguably, there were some areas in which punches were pulled. but it was certainly, taken it all together, a much more searching review of nuclear power and nuclear policy than anything that has come since Fukushima, even though the Fukushima reactor design is similar to designs in use in about 24 or 5 plants in the US. One important point with regard to Pilgrim and most other reactors in place is that one of the reforms that came out of the 3 Mile Island accident was, for the first time, a requirement that there be NRC reviewed and approved off-site emergency response plans. Now, what that means is that every unit licensed before the 3 Mile Island accident, that is almost all, was not required to have an effective off-site emergency response plan. So plants could be sited and located without reference to whether effective evacuation was really possible. And the challenge facing the regulatory process after the accident became, how do you define the success in the likelihood of an emergency? And if you adopt a definition that requires that within a few hours 100% of the people have to be capable of being evacuated, you will shut down a substantial number of the existing nuclear plants because they weren't sited with that requirement in mind. The regulatory process, the regulators weren't prepared to do that. So what you have in a number of locations now are emergency response plans that were not pushed to a standard of 100% effectiveness within a defined period of hours. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to understand what the fundamental standard was. They are, for the most part, collections of requirements, many of the requirements sensible, but essentially it's a do-what-you-can framework. In addition, the recommendations after 3 Mile Island with regard to the role of the public were that it should be more effectively represented in the regulatory process. A public counsel's office was one recommendation. Intervenor funding was another. Many states use both of those tools. I've lost track of the extent to which they're in use in Massachusetts now. Congress prohibited the NRC from adopting them, and so it's never taken root there. And in fact, in recent years, the NRC has substantially cut back on the ability of intervenors to participate in the regulatory process. So this is an area in which U.S. regulation has regressed since 3 Mile Island. There isn't any reason to doubt the seriousness with which the NRC took its responsibility to look at the substantive technical issues raised by Fukushima, although as Greg indicated in some of his dissenting opinions, the pace at which it's applied its requirements may have left something to be desired. But still, the type of fundamental review that followed 3 Mile Island was never undertaken. In order to transition now from the 3 Mile Island accident to the question of nuclear economics and the Renaissance, let me just note that the industry has tended to claim since 3 Mile Island that that accident and overreaction to it by the regulators, by the environmental community, largely explain why nuclear power fell out of favor and no new reactors were built in the U.S. But that is not the correct assessment of what happened. At the same time as the 3 Mile Island accident, the U.S. moved toward competitive power procurement for the first time. The issue was taken out of the framework in which utilities would propose and utilities commissions would decide. and opened up to participation by independent power producers. That in turn evolved into the competitive power markets that we have today. And it had the effect of shifting risk from customers to investors. And within a framework in which investors actually had to take the risk of things going wrong, cost overruns, plant cancellations, poor operation, they weren't prepared to back nuclear anymore. And so new nuclear has never bid in an auction in a single power market, not only in the US, but anywhere else in the world. And it's that fact, much more than the accident at 3 Mile Island, that explains the fall off in nuclear licensing after the Fukushima accident. Now, one more slide about Fukushima and its impacts beyond Japan, and there are a number here that I'm not going to touch on. I did want to mention the hydrogen explosions. Greg talked about them too. I want to put them in a slightly different context, because before the accident at 3 Mile Island, the presence of hydrogen in a percentage in a containment in which it would constitute an explosive mixture was deemed to be impossible by the regulators. So precautions did not have to be taken against it. In fact, we've had hydrogen explosions in every one of the serious accidents, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and the 3 Fukushima units. So this business of deeming things impossible, which also underlay the failure to adopt emergency response plans, the other underlined item up there, was a part of regulatory thinking that now is, fortunately, I think, I won't say behind us, but at least on its way out the door, and has been followed by a way of thinking about accidents that says, well, you have to accept that things beyond what you think are possible may still go wrong and may have to be guarded against. But still, in a time of economic pressure, and that's what I'm going to move into now, there are limits to how far you can push that type of thinking and still be able to license and build nuclear plants. So the tension that will always exist for nuclear power, because of its fundamental nature of a large amount of deadly material that has to be contained, will be how much money can you spend to contain that material and still be competitive. And for that, we need to look at the economic context. This is the first year in 15 in which operating nuclear plants have closed. There are some plants still being built in the South, but only under a framework in which the utility regulators have said the customers will take all the risk. That's not the framework in use in most of the rest of the country. All of the rest of the so-called Renaissance plants, there were once 31, have either been canceled or postponed or put into a posture in which the applicants are seeking licenses for plants that they have no intention to build, but the licenses are good for 20 years. This doesn't have much to do with Fukushima. What it does have to do with is cheaper alternatives, notably gas and energy efficiency, the collapse of demand after the recession in 2008, and as to the operating plants, the fact that as they get older, their capacity factors decline a bit, and they come up against the need to make expensive capital investments, the kind of thing that Greg described at Crystal River and at San Onofre. And it'll come up from time to time with other plants too, especially because of items like post-Fukushima repairs. The ability to recover those costs over the remaining life of the plants is in doubt, and that's why some have closed and more are likely to. This next graph, which is taken from the World Nuclear Industry Status Report, which has a lot of useful material in it for those of you who are interested, is an important one to understand when you put new nuclear reactors, and in fact the existing plants too, in the context of the claims made about nuclear energy and climate change. Because, and this is a part of my presentation that for the most part I'm going to have to skip over, So I'll just ask you to take my word for it. The number of reactors you have to build to achieve a fairly small slice of climate improvement is so large, on the order of 1,000 between now and 2050, that you really had to start a major scale-up over the last 10 years, or at least be on the verge of one now, to be able to say that nuclear power was in fact going to make a significant contribution. Well, this is what's actually happened. It's anything but a major scale-up. From 2002, which is kind of year zero for the nuclear renaissance forward, we haven't gained in nuclear output. What this chart shows you is that we've declined, both in terawatt hours and in nuclear as a percentage of total electricity generation in the world. So this fundamental characteristic of nuclear, that it tends to get more and more expensive in order to be safe enough, that it tends to get more and more expensive because the costs of construction are so hard to control, is completely at odds with relying heavily on nuclear as a bulwark against climate change. And now, as promised, I'm going to go a little more quickly through this material than I would like to, but I hope I'll be doing it in a way that it doesn't reduce it to incoherence. I did want to say a word in the context now of the economics about the contribution of Fukushima to the change in perceptions, not of health and safety risk, but of nuclear's economic risk. And for that, just remember how you yourself learned about the Fukushima accidents, watching nuclear plants explode on television. That's not something that ever happened in the world before. And when you add to that the evacuation, the fact that the world's fourth largest utility within a few weeks had become essentially a ward of the Japanese state, the fact that the accident is really still continuing, and now put yourself in the shoes of an investor in potential energy sources. And there's nothing here that makes putting money into new nuclear units more attractive. On top of that, put yourself in the shoes of a legislator who's being asked in one way or another to approve nuclear subsidy, loan guarantees, production tax credits. And once again, this is a picture that tells you that that's not a good place to put the taxpayers' money. And in fact, we've seen in a number of states in recent years a movement away from the kinds of legislation that enabled the construction of those few nuclear units in the South. So let me wrap up by talking a little about nuclear in comparison to the alternatives in the context of climate change. Because you're still left at the end of this rather gloomy picture of nuclear on its own terms with the question of what the alternatives are. And nuclear proponents will essentially say, well, there's no choice. There's nothing else that's a base load power source, nothing else that can provide anything like nuclear's large quantities of low carbon energy. This pie chart was prepared several years ago by a couple of professors at Princeton, Stephen Pacala and Robert Sokolow. And it's not predictive. It doesn't purport to tell you what will happen, but it does lay out in a useful way some of the possible ways of putting a significant dent in the emission of greenhouse gases. And one wedge on that chart has the effect of preventing 1 billion tons of carbon per year by 2054. Each wedge involves scaling up of technologies that are already deployed on an industrial scale. You need 7 to get to 500 parts per million, more to get to 350. There are a total of 15. The wedges are divided into these categories: energy efficiency, alternative transportation, enhancing natural carbon sinks. And there are 4 that involve decarbonizing the electric sector, and nuclear is one of those 4. This last issue is important to understand for a couple of reasons. The most important is that in fighting climate change, you're not confined to the electric sector. Nuclear has to compete with wedges from across the economy, and if any of them are cheaper and better, then they're going to be deployed, or should be deployed, sooner. And so it isn't just a matter of discussing nuclear against coal, nuclear against renewables. It's nuclear versus better housing, nuclear versus better fuel efficiency, nuclear versus better agricultural practices that one talks about when one talks about fighting climate change. The nuclear wedge itself, as I indicated earlier, involves building a lot of nuclear, and in addition, it involves building the enrichment facilities and the waste facilities capable of handling the fuel needs and the output of those facilities. And in addition, you have to have the enrichment, in addition, you have the problem of the fact that nuclear output has not been rising in the last 10 years, but declining. And it takes a long time to turn that ship around. I mean, you're not going to get from where we are now to a point at which you're adding 100 or 200 plants a year to the nuclear fleet between now and 2025 or between now and 2030. So a major commitment to nuclear to fight climate change is also an admission that we're not going to make much of a dent in climate change until 25 years from now. And that's not a situation that climate scientists would be the slightest bit comfortable with regard to the damage that will be done in the interim. This chart, which I'd love to spend more time on than we're going to, let me just note about it that it comes not from Greenpeace, not from me, not from Amory Lovins, but from Exelon, which is the corporation that operates the largest fleet of nuclear reactors in the United States. And what it's telling you, this is their view of the low carbon options available to them in that electric generation sector that contain 4 of the wedges. What it's telling you is that new nuclear, the dark blue on your far right, is more expensive than almost all of the low carbon options that they see as being available to them in the electric sector, a mix of efficiency, substitution of gas for coal, upgrades of nuclear plants, which they've now decided are also too expensive. But in any case, not a pretty picture for new nuclear. Okay, so how do we choose among the wedges? Well, in a nutshell, I don't see any alternative ultimately to a price on carbon, but we don't seem to be going there in the Congress, even though in New England we do have the regional greenhouse gas initiative, and there are parallels elsewhere in the country. If we have a price on carbon, there's no particular likelihood that nuclear emerges as a winner. And short of that, we are just going to have to work hard on legislators and utility regulators to adopt a wise set of energy policies that take this kind of information into account. One thing we can't do, assuming I'm where I want to be here, is accept the notion that we have to adopt an all of the above, or we have to do everything energy policy. We don't approach serious problems on that way in other sectors. We don't fight world hunger with caviar. We don't fight housing shortages with palaces. We don't fight transportation shortages with Lamborghinis. And we're not going to fight climate change successfully by designating new nuclear with its very high costs as being a preferred solution and rushing to put all of our investment into that. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to get to the questions very soon, but we have two just brief additions to the agenda. First, I'd like to welcome filmmaker Adam Salkin from Los Angeles. He's done a short film illustrating some of the safety concerns that Arnie Gunderson mentioned in his presentation. So, Mr. Salkin.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm honored to have been asked to be a part of this event and to be sitting with all these people who have unique firsthand knowledge of this issue and are now doing all they can to protect public health from the dangers caused by nuclear power today. The reason I'm here comes from my own firsthand experience. I grew up next to a number of nuclear accidents that happened on the border of Los Angeles on a site called the Santa Susana Field Lab. And I still wonder if the radiation released from these accidents is the cause of my own health problems and those of my family and friends. This is the question that set me off on a journey for answers, not only about my neighborhood and family, but families across the country and around the world, from San Onofre to Pilgrim, Ikata to Fukushima, and further. I've now spoken to experts far and wide, and although in time we'll release a film that will show much of what I've learned, I was asked to come here today, quickly throw some raw footage together, and address Pilgrim. Because for Pilgrim, the millions of people who live within the 50-mile radius and our entire country, the time is now. These issues can no longer be ignored. And just as the example that Arnie showed, or spoke about actually, regarding Pilgrim, what I'm going to show are is an example of Indian Point. And from the experts I've spoken to, these are problems that are happening across the country. And I've done what I could to put something together, and I hope that these few minutes you're about to see can help force some positive changes that are long overdue. Thank you.
We left before dawn. I had to find out if what all the experts were telling me was true. Could nuclear power plants across the country be so vulnerable? I was also told that the FBI listed Indian Point as one of the top terrorist targets in the United States. We made our way up the Hudson River towards the plant.
Once we come around this bend right here, we could be looking for the patrol boats at that point.
Yep. You'll start to see the buoys of the security zone first.
Okay. I just started the stopwatch because we're now in the area that they're patrolling. So at this point, we're going to come around the corner and we're going to either see a patrol boat or not, and we'll see how long it takes until we see a patrol boat. You see any patrol boats?
There are no patrol boats present, which is the usual SOP here on what goes on outside of Indian Point.
It's still hard to believe that we're here and that there are no patrol boats. How do you have no patrol? It's like they got to assume that there's just no chance anything could ever happen. You would think this is where we would have the biggest buildup of military force in the entire country. This is where it would be, right here. There'd be walls, there'd be security, there'd be military force, there would be everything to stop what we know can happen, like what happened on September 11th. An hour and 21 minutes, almost 22 minutes. And that's the security right there, that keep out buoy. That's the security. The intake structure is right there, which amounts to right here on this map. Intake structure. Pulling in 2.5 billion gallons a day of water. So if a boat with explosive decided that they wanted to go and head towards that intake structure, which is about 900 feet away. And the only thing to stop them would be one of these sluies. And there's, right here, we can speed up. Get in front of him. He's trying to get in front of him. He decided to make a right and go straight into the facility. There's nothing to stop it. The patrol boat that's not even here will be able to do anything anyway. I really thought that it would be impossible to be out here this long. So we're 4 hours and 45 minutes in, and patrol just showed up to keep the plant secure. I guess I can ask them what took them 5 hours to get here, and ask them if they're the ones that are in charge of keeping this plant secure against any terrorist attack. If they say yes, I guess I could start asking them questions about how, if they're not actually here, can they keep it safe?
The 9/11 Commission report, Mohammed, the head of the 9/11 hijackers, they considered attacking and targeting nuclear power plants in the United States. They did not do so because they thought they were heavily defended. They weren't defended before 9/11, they're not heavily defended now.
Early the next morning, I rented a plane to see how close I could get to Indian Point from the air. Turns out, pretty close.
Alright, there's a bunch of wires I gotta clear here. Alright, just hold on a minute, I'm gonna push down here. Yep. Pretty bumpy. Yeah, see if I can settle this out.
Pretty close.
That's 500 feet right there.
So how fast are we going right now?
I'm doing about 120.
120. What kind of an expert pilot would you have to be? Is it very difficult to hit a building?
No, I mean, you definitely would have to have some training. You know, I mean, the 9/11 guys had training in Florida.
What are your thoughts on the facility on Indian Point?
You have to get control of an aircraft like this in order to do it. Second of all, you have to be crazy enough to do it. How much damage can you really do? I don't really know.
Yeah, the spent fuel pools don't have the containment that the reactors do. Those containment domes, they're the concrete.
Right.
The spent fuel pools are regular buildings, but they have more radiation in them than the reactors do.
And the reactors themselves?
Yep.
Yeah, see now, I didn't even know that. That's a fact that I don't even know.
And I've been asked to introduce Mrs. Junko Abe, who is here with a message from the people of Japan. Abe. Her last name is Abe. I need an interpreter too. Yes.
Thank you very much, everyone, moderator, presenters, for giving us time to introduce this flag to you. I carried this from a small town of Ikata. A fisherman, Mr. Kikuchi, wanted me to carry this to New York and Boston to show their friendship and coalition, because the nuclear program is smokes fuel and other two plants sits in their town, and the fishermen and orange farmers are very worried, especially after Fukushima nuclear plant. Their programs support This is very special because the flag is for good luck and for good fishing. Every time a new fishing boat goes into water for the first time, fisherman is given this flag as a present and for good luck. And every time they have good fishing, they can catch a lot of fish. They put up this flag offshore to show people on the coast waiting that they have a lot of fish today. Very good indication. So just please feel what the people want and how they want to connect with you with the same problem and turn it to something good connection. Thank you.
Okay, now we're going to have some questions. We're going to begin with the media, and if you're credentialed media, you have a media pass, press pass, you're welcome to ask a question. We have a portable microphone here. Any of my colleagues in the media? Just come right over to the microphone, or she'll come over to you.
So, Erin Hill with Boston Globe. And my question is, Pilgrim has a license to operate for 20 more years. So, barring a successful campaign to shut the plant down, what does the facility need to do to mitigate the chances of a Fukushima-type disaster?
Who would like to handle that? Mr. Yasko?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, to some extent, one, I mean, you have to deal with re-examining the hardened vents. That was clearly an issue that was identified. The NRC issued orders to go back and reanalyze the hardened vents and ensure that they will operate appropriately. That, you know, ideally would help address that. You've got to put in place a better mechanism for coping with a station blackout for a much, much longer period of time. I mean, right now, most plants have capabilities, and I haven't looked recently at Pilgrim's planning, but they have capabilities to deal with a complete loss of electric power, station blackout event for, you know, generally in the order of hours. That's something, a coping that needs to be capable of lasting for days, realistically. You know, if you did those two things, you would, you know, greatly reduce the chance of some external event, you know, like an earthquake initiating a severe accident. But most likely, you know, I shouldn't say most likely, but, you know, probably the accident that's going to affect Pilgrim is probably going to be something different than an earthquake, tsunami type scenario. It's going to be something that attacks aspects of the plant that have not yet been addressed. So, you know, fundamentally, that's the challenge you deal with, is that you can't ever, you just can't rule out that there's something out there that's going to cause a severe accident. You know, it's probably not likely, but you can't completely rule it out. So, tackling the station blackout would be a significant event, a significant issue, and certainly dealing with the hardened vents. And of course, filtering, which the NRC decided not to pursue, but filtering of those hardened vents would be a significant initiative as well, because it gives you more flexibility in venting to not have to worry about potential contamination, which there's some conflicting information about whether or not that really impacted the decision-making at the Daiichi plant, that they postponed venting because of concerns that they would spread contamination, and as a result. But if you had filters, then you would reduce the worry about and not have to necessarily debate that issue more. So, you know, those are a number of things. Doing the updated seismic analysis would be good. I mean, basically, you know, going through the list of the 12 things that the NRC identified and implementing those will help considerably.
Hi, my name name is Carol Kozma. I'm here for WATD News in Marshfield. I just wanted to know, one of the things that came up is obviously if we are shutting down this plant, there are going to be people without jobs, and we will need to find something to replace the energy that the nuclear power plant has been giving from closing other plants and so on. How long does it take to transition, and are people able to find jobs and so on, or is it really a problematic issue?
Is that for me? Or do you want to answer it?
Well, certainly on the, one of the things to consider, and there are experts here, the decommissioning of this plant is a number of decades, correct? I mean, this is not a plant that...
Years.
Years,
yeah.
Certainly. So first of all, there's going to be a transition. The plant would not be decommissioned immediately. There would be a phase out of the plant. And then there would be a tremendous number of jobs created as the plant is decommissioned and after the decommissioning. So that right there is an issue. And then we have to have a public conversation about either if retraining is required or another sector of the economy that the employees can be moved. But I think we have to have that responsible discussion as part of the public discourse. There's 650 jobs there and families that depend on those jobs. So that is certainly part of the decommissioning conversation. As far as the energy end of the question, I would defer to one of you gentlemen.
Well, the
question was the jobs.
Yeah.
Well, the jobs and energy.
The right up to that microphone there.
Let's see. Let me see if I can get closer. There is some experience from other closed plants. For one thing, there's a demand for skilled workers elsewhere in the industry. When Shoreham closed on Long Island after a very brief period of operation, the workers who wanted to stay on Long Island were retrained by the company. Now that was a vertically integrated utility, which Energy in Massachusetts is not, but many of them wound up as the backbone of the Long Island Lighting Company's energy efficiency programs. So with warning and with a committed retraining program within the state, there certainly are possibilities, and there are possibilities elsewhere in the nuclear industry. But I don't want to minimize the issue. These are high skill, high paying positions, and for older workers who want to stay in the Plymouth area, closing the plant will definitely not be the best news that they had that year.
Hello, my name is David Unger. I'm with the Christian Science Monitor. This is a little bit off topic, but I'm wondering if you might address what, if any, impact the government shutdown has on the nuclear industry. I haven't checked what the latest is today, but last I saw, if it continues, NRC will have to begin curtailing staff and implementing their shutdown plan. And I'm wondering, especially for Mr. Yazko and Mr. Bradford, if you could address what that means for the industry and what the public should know about the NRC's plan, if there's any kind of concerns there.
Well, I can't say exactly what their planning is now. I can speak to when I was chairman and we were going through the same exercise. Although, I'll be honest, the estimates I've heard is that what I heard is somewhere around 300 staff that they're likely to keep when they get to the more reduced staffing levels. We were looking at a slightly higher number, but essentially what you keep is your ability to do your mission critical functions, what are called mission critical functions. So for the NRC, that is emergency, it's incident response. So it's the ability to have people there in the event that there's an accident or an incident in a nuclear power plant. I believe resident inspectors are also in that scope of individuals. I don't know about routine inspections. Likely some of those activities would be postponed if they could be. If there are safety-sensitive inspections that need to be done, I would expect those would be done. Although, it's possible if the personnel are not available and a mission-critical activity needs to be done by a utility, and there are not resources to do that inspection, it's possible that that activity wouldn't be able to go forward. I think that's really the area where there's more uncertainty about those kinds of things. But the routine kind of regulatory actions would likely not proceed. Legal actions, things like that don't involve any immediate health and safety impacts would be postponed. I mean, as far as the utilities go, I don't see that there wouldn't be any reason that plants would be shut down as a result of it or anything like that.
Okay. Any other questions from the press? Sandra?
One moment, we have one more question.
Libby Halevi, nuclear hot seat. I'm also a survivor of 3 Mile Island from 1 mile away. My question is for Prime Minister Khan. You referred in your speech to having a blunt, tell-it-like-it-is style in politics, and I wish to take advantage of that stance that you spoke of. Those of us who are in contact with people in Japan know of ongoing serious health impact from radiation exposure, especially in the children. Confirmed thyroid cancers, and 70% of children tested already showing thyroid abnormalities. We have also heard repeatedly, so repeatedly that it is not a question, that doctors have been ordered to ignore all information related to radiation, and patients are cautioned prior to examination not to bring up radiation-related symptoms to their doctors if they hope to receive care. This represents planned statistical ability to deny any effect from the radiation by the so-called experts. So when you state, as you did yesterday during your interviews, that experts say that any health effects from the accident at Fukushima are inconclusive, it begs the questions. Do you actually believe that they are representing the medical truth? Are you or were you aware of this systemic manipulation of medical information of the radiation impact while you were in office? Were you involved in any way in the creation of this institutionalized system of denial? And why did you not order the evacuation of children from Japan when their mothers were crying out for you to do so?
Well, we'll let him answer. Just to be clear, I described him as the blunt, tell-it-like-it-is style from my reading. So don't pin that on him, but we'll let him go for it.
先ほど私の講演の中でも申し上げたように、子どもの甲状腺がんの発生については要素の投与などが、必ずしも的確に行われていないこともあって、私自身は心配をしております。
As I said in my speech, with regards to the children's thyroid cancer, etc., yes, the iodine pills were not properly distributed in time, and that's I have a personal concern about that. Yes.
で現在、甲状腺がんを含めて、子どもに限りませんが、被災地の被爆の可能性のある人たちの健康診断を福島の病院を中心にして、長期にわたって継続するという、そういう方針が取られています。
Well, currently, what government is doing is to monitor the health of the people in Fukushima, and I can't read my own handwriting, sorry. So I guess that, I'm sorry, maybe I'm just skipping some of what he said. And then the hospitals in Fukushima are basically in charge of monitoring, long-term monitoring of health effects.
その中でその甲状腺がんの発生が他の地域に比べて、明らかに多いとか、いやその代わりがないとかという点についてはそれぞれの専門家あるいはお医者さんによって、必ずしも判断が一致しておりません。
But then doctors disagree with each other whether they are, observing the noticeable sort of abnormalities in terms of thyroid cancer.
そういう中に今ご指摘にあったように、お医者さんに対してその組織的に、いわば正しい情報を隠蔽するということがされているのではないかということですが、今私は政権の立場にいませんので、少なくとも私や私の党が政権にいたときに、そういう隠蔽を支持するということは、当然ながらやっておりませんし。
As you pointed out, the possibility that maybe there is a systemic sort of cover-up of the health of abnormalities, and that's something done by the government. Well, myself and my own party is no longer, in power. But as far as I can vouch for, I can tell you, while I was in the office, or while our party was in the office, we did not order such systemic corruption.
これからも今ご指摘があったような意見ももちろん国内でもありますので、そういうこの子どもの甲状腺がんが増えているというデータを持っている人と、それを否定する人の間でオープンな形で議論していくということが必要だし、それについては私も努力したいと思っています。
What I think is needed is that, of course, in Japan too, there are a lot of people who believe that there are a lot of thyroid cancer happening among Fukushima children. So what is needed is that those people who have those data themselves and those people who disagree with that should discuss openly in public, and then we take it from there. And that's something what I think should happen, and I'm going to make personal effort to ensure that.
Thank you. Welcome.
Hello, I'm Jeff Don from the Associated Press. This is a question, first I think for Dr. Yasko, if he doesn't mind. You indicated in your presentation that you think the nuclear society should perhaps begin to find a way to phase out nuclear power, or the industry should develop a way of generating nuclear power without the threat of a serious accident. What does probability risk assessment or any way of assessing risk tell you about the likelihood of developing nuclear power that has no risk of a serious accident in your mind? Is that realistic?
Well, it's realistic. It's different. It's certainly much lower power levels, and nuclear is not going to do that at 1,000 megawatts. You have, here in downtown Boston, there's a research reactor at MIT. It's not used for power generation. It generates a lower amount of power, but that reactor does not present any risk of severe accident. So, generally lower power levels, will get you that. There are, ways technologically where you better manage decay heat, design fuel differently. There are, if we set our mind to it, there are likely ways that you could achieve that. But fundamentally, you probably wouldn't have such large plants. You would probably be dealing with much smaller plants, but again, that may not necessarily be a bad thing.
Hi, I'm working on a documentary on nuclear power that will be on HBO, and I have a multi-part question for you, Dr. Yasko. During the accident at Fukushima, can you describe what led up to your recommendation that American citizens in Japan should evacuate 50 miles from Fukushima? And in particular, can you explain your concerns about what could happen with the spent fuel pools at Fukushima? And can you also talk about what your concerns are for the risks that could happen here with nuclear fuel pools in the United States, particularly at the Mark I reactors, which include Pilgrim and Vermont Yankee here in New England, where there is only a 10-mile evacuation zone? And finally, can you...
I gotta write these down.
Yes. Can you elaborate on your statement that you made earlier this year that the current fleet of operating, if you can elaborate on your statement made earlier this year that the current fleet of operating nuclear power plants in the United States should be phased out because regulators cannot guarantee against an accident causing widespread land contamination. And could you share with us what led you to that conclusion? Thank you.
Well, I'll touch quickly on the 50 miles. I mean, the 50 miles was based on a number of factors. We looked at scenarios in which there was complete damage to reactors. There were multiple reactors that had damage. There were spent fuel pools involved. So there were a number of scenarios that we ran analyses with, and they all generally said that there was a potential for contamination, at distances out to 50 miles. I think we actually had some that said 30 to 40 miles. I remember at one point asking the staff, well, should we go with 30 or 40? And they said, no, I think 50 is a conservative assessment. So, but it's important to keep in mind that this was effectively a travel advisory to American citizens. It was not an evacuation of Americans because we were not providing that service. It was a guidance to Americans to stay away and avoid those areas. Much like, to some extent, you get guidance if there's a very contagious disease that may be affecting a region. The State Department will issue guidance that says, avoid certain areas because of the potential for contracting this disease. So it was viewed kind of in that context. But it primarily was just looking at scenarios that considered progression of the accident. Part of that was the spent fuel, but it was not exclusively, and we looked at additionally scenarios that did not involve spent fuel pools, and they all generally showed these larger contamination events. In terms of spent fuel pools in the United States, I mean, the biggest issue is whether or not you should put more fuel from pools into dry gas storage. Studies have been done, and they don't show significant conclusions that dry gas storage is significantly safer than spent fuel pools. The biggest issue fundamentally is the concern of a fire. Having a fire can then release a lot of material into the atmosphere. That is more of a concern when the fuel is fresh and coming right out of the reactor and into the pool. After a period of operation from the reactor, that risk decreases significantly as the fuel cools, thermally, as well as a lot of short-lived radionuclides decay away. So there's all kinds of different configurations of spent fuel pools in the United States and different reactors. So each reactor has a different kind of risk and a hazard from that. But fundamentally, I think the prudent action is to move fuel into dry gas storage. I mean, it's a simpler system. Although no studies have really demonstrated a significant increase in safety by doing that, but it just seems to make sense to do it. And then the last question. I mean, it's nothing different, I think, than what I've said here today. I mean, all these reactor designs today, they have a problem with decay heat removal. So when the fission reaction shuts off, you're left with a tremendous amount of heat that needs to be removed from the reactor core. If you can't remove that heat, you have an accident like you had at Fukushima. That's simply what it is. I mean, it's not that, that's really what's going on. The fission reaction has stopped. and then you have this, which is a little bit different from Chernobyl, in which part of what you had at Chernobyl was a very active fission reaction and an uncontrolled fission reaction. But the Fukushima problem is really one of this decay heat removal, and it relies on systems that are subject to failure. I mean, the failure rates are very low, but they're subject to failure. So, that's really what the issue is, and which I've talked a little bit about here. So, thanks.
Thank you. We're going to move to the index cards, and the first question is for Senator Wolf. Please be specific in your concerns that you saw. Please be specific to the concerns you saw at Pilgrim in your tour. And I would ask if you could answer in any way you like, of course, but I'd be interested in what you saw in terms of a backup power system as well.
Yeah. What was interesting in the tour, and I forget which speaker, I apologize, but somebody talked about sort of the canary in the coal mine being the appearance and the secondary and tertiary systems and how they were being maintained. And, you know, it is always problematic to try to judge what's going on underneath by the paint on the top. But I think when you see a commitment to overall, to the overall integrity of the facility based on what I saw just on a very skin level, it was not encouraging. I mean, the place looked like it was 1960s, 1970s technology, right down to the analog warning lights and the meters. It just didn't look like a plant that was being modernized along the way. It did not have that appearance. When you get off of an elevator, for example, to go up to the top floor where you have access to the storage pool, for example, and you get off the elevator and you step on flypaper and you ask, you know, what is this, as you hear your foot being ripped from the flypaper, and you're being told that that's there to remove radioactive material from your feet. That doesn't give you the impression of high technology. I understand why it's there, but you go around this plant and you feel like you're in an old environment. Now, that having been said, we were shown the primary backup diesel generators, which were the primary pump mechanism for if there was an electric failure. And they're old. I mean, I know old engine technology when I see it. These are old backup generators. We were then walked around to the backside of the plant where you see the addition of the next level of system to provide cooling water if the electricity fails. And that's the second. The third that we were shown, and I'm still wondering whether this was serious or a joke, was a Kubota tractor with a generator on the back that you pull start so that you can run a pump to spray water at a nuclear reactor. I'm just wondering if you guys have seen that in any other plant. That seems kind of nutty to me, that, you know, the fallback of the fallback of the fallback is, you know, a hose off of a trailer off of a Honda generator like you might find if you had a hurricane and you went out to your garage. This is a nuclear power plant. Again, as somebody who looks at modern technology a lot in the aviation field, I did not have a warm and fuzzy about that. As we're toured around the plant, for example, there is tritium being detected in some of the ground wells in front of the plant, between the plant and the ocean. When somebody says to you during that plant, we're not sure where this is coming from, whether it's runoff from the roof or whether it's a leaky valve or a pipe somewhere, I think anytime I hear the words, we're not sure, being given by somebody who's giving you a tour of a nuclear power facility, that's not right. It doesn't make sense. And I know that we are chasing small aggravating pumps, valves, lines that seem to be springing leaks. Those are all warning signs of a system that we should not feel comfortable about. So I guess, you know, the one other thing I want to point out, because it's been raised here already, is the aviation side of this. As somebody who, I said in my opening remarks, has been flying around here looking at that plant for 35 years, understanding that one of the plant designs is a weaker roof so that if there's a release, it's upward and not outward, and then understanding where the actual storage is of where the fuel pool is, which is up high in I know that I'm sure the NRC has done studies about how big an airplane moving how fast. I was actually told during the tour by someone who didn't realize my expertise in aviation that it would be aerodynamically not possible for an airplane to fly into the roof of that reactor. And I'm sitting there saying, this just isn't credible. If this is the way information is being shared with legislators, I have to question the credibility of a lot of the information that's being shared. So I do appreciate the fact that we were given a chalk talk when we went to the plant of a couple of hours before we did the tour. And I think the idea was this would make us more comfortable about how the plant was being managed, the security and the technology. And as I said in my opening remarks, I actually was less comfortable by the time I left, in spite of, and I want to reiterate, the good intentions, the expertise, the experience, and the hard work being done by the employees at that plant. I in no way would degrade that. I have a lot of respect for it. But aging systems fail, period. And we are human beings, and human beings can make errors. And those are not fail-safe systems in that plant. These plants depend on human input all the time. And we have seen in plants, we have seen shutdowns and failures that are based on missed signals, missed lights, misinterpretation of data as it's being presented by the technology. It's a plethora of stuff. And you don't want to be here for another hour while I talk about it, but we could have that discussion, and you might have a feeling on this too, the two of you guys.
You guys want to address that or move on? Okay. This question is, it seems that in both Japan and in the United States there's a problem in that the industry lobbyists have an unhealthy influence on the regulating function of the government. Do you agree? And what is being done or can be done in both countries to address this?
Who should answer that? Who should answer that question?
What was that?
Who should answer that question?
If the Prime Minister would like to answer it, he's welcome.
だから圧力団体、業界の方にですね、政府にいろいろ圧力がかかると思うんですけれども、そういうのにどういうふうに対応していったらいいですかね。The question, the point of question is basically, how are you going to remedy the situation or cope with the situation? Or
well, is it true that the industry lobbyists have an unhealthy influence? Is it true? And if so, how or can it be addressed?
まずそういう圧力があるかどうかということで、もしもあるとすれば、それにどういうふうに対応していったらいいと思われますか。
先ほどの議論の中で米国においてもロビングの活動が電力会社によって活発に行われているという話がありました。我が国においても電力会社さらにはそれに関連する原発メーカーあるいはそれに関連する労働組合さらにはメディアに対してたくさんの広告を電力会社が独占企業でありながら広告を打ってますので、そういう力などを使って、いわゆるそれを全て合わせて我が国では原子力村と呼んでおりますが、そういう力を使っていろいろな形で政府だけではなくて与党野党さらにはメディア関係者学者そういう人たちに自分たちと反対する議論が出ないように幅広く圧力を長い間かけてきました。
Yes, here I understand that there is quite a pressure, lobbying pressure from the industry. In Japan too, in electric companies, power companies have regional monopolies, and they have enormous power, and also the sort of companies related to the electric generation. Like suppliers. All those are also part of the whole big system, also included is the labor unions and media. Why media? Because power companies with a lot of power and money, they become the sometimes the largest sponsors for media. So they yield a lot of power, and it's a fairly large-scale and multi-faceted sort of lobbying effort. You know, they lobby the government, not just the administration, but the all different parties, and they also lobby the scientists and media. So it's a really widespread and long-term lobbying efforts that we have seen in Japan. Yes.
一つだけ米国と違って日本の電力会社が違っている大きな力の根源を説明します。
I'd like to explain one difference between United States and Japan in terms of how electric power companies have so much power.
我が国の電力会社は9つありますが、それはすべて地域独占です。
Well, in Japan we have 9 electric power companies, and they each have a regional monopoly of their own.
そして価格を決めるときの考え方は、必要なコストに対して一定の率の利潤を乗せて価格を決める、これが認められています。
And it's allowed in Japan. It is allowed to set the rate based on the cost that they request, they project, and with the addition of the profit margin.
つまり競争がないわけです。
That is, there is no competition.
ですから電力会社はそういうロビング活動やいろんなコマーシャルやいろんなところに、つまりは経済的メリットを与えて自分たちの考え方に賛成させるようなところに多額のお金を使ってもそれは必要経費として認められますから、その必要経費を加えて何%の利潤で価格を決めると。ですからいくらでもお金が使えるということです。
So the more power companies put their money into, say, media advertisement, you know, and the sponsor, television, whatever, that's considered to be their cost, and that can be basically added to their sort of cost base, and then so that will increase their rate, but nobody questions that.
もちろん現在そういうその独占的なシステムを壊そうとしてますが、まだ残念ながら完全には壊せてません。
Of course, there is a movement in Japan to change this monopoly system, but we are far from achieving the change.
Would one of the commissioners like to talk about the influence of lobbyists on the NRC?
You don't want the politician to talk about that?
Would a politician like to talk about it? I'll take all comers.
Well, no, I mean, I would just say this, and it's stating the obvious, that when you deregulate an industry that is as crucial as this, in effect what you're doing when you privatize it is you're allowing shareholder return, not a dirty word, but you got to understand what that means, to play very heavily into the process of public policy. And the intersection of shareholder return, public policy, especially long-term public policy as it relates to energy production, it's very problematic because it's much cheaper to hire a lot of lobbyists and come talk to politicians, I'll use the value-neutral word talk to, than it is to invest in long-term technology change. And if what your main-term focus on is shareholder return, and that's usually a short-term return, you can't expect the long-term public policy needs to be met. So I think we have to re-examine the deregulation of the industry and how to manage it so that built into the cost is not only the cost in the short term, but the cost of really investing in a sustainable energy future and phasing out nuclear power along the way.
Okay. The next question that I was given has a small preamble here. The situation in Germany is not a good argument for removing nuclear power. Even though they closed all their plants, Germany imports electricity from France's nuclear power plants. So the question is, can Japan's economy survive without nuclear power to generate electricity?
ドイツとやっぱり日本は様子が違うということで、ドイツは結局原発やめるって言っても、フランスとか原発やってるところから輸入してる、電気を輸入してる現状があるので、だから日本はだから本当にこれでこの原発やめるって言って、電気その自立が達成されるのか、させるのか。
まずドイツについてよくフランスから電気を買っているから原発ゼロにできるんだという指摘がありますが、私がドイツの関係者から聞いた中では、確かにフランスから電気を買うこともありますが、売ることもあると。昨年1年間で言えば売った量の方が少し多かったということで、必ずしも一方的に不足分を原発で発生した電気をフランスから買っているという指摘は当たってないというのが現状だと理解しています。
I'd like to point out the fact that some information that I have through the people that I know over there, that yes, somebody pointed out that Germany relies on the import of electricity from France, which has nuclear power. However, this information that I have is that's not always the case. Sometimes Germany actually sells power to France as well. And today they are actually they might be actually exporting more than importing. Yes? Okay. その通りです。
そして我が国では 3.11 前、約電力の3割が原発によって供給されていました。
In Japan, prior to 3/11, 30% of the electricity was supplied by nuclear power.
しかし、例えば今日を見ますと、現在原発は一機も動いておりません。
But if you look at Japan today, though, there is no reactor currently is operating right today.
で、その供給量が原発による電力の供給量が減った分は大きくは節電という形と、あと残りはいわゆる化石燃料を使った火力発電所で、例えば工場が会社が持っていたようなものを活用して不足分を補っています。
So how did Japan sort of fill the gap? Primarily by reducing the energy, increasing energy efficiency, and also, of course, by the increased use of coal, fossil fuel power plants, and which some power companies already had facility infrastructure in place.
そして同時に、これは先ほどの講演でも言いましたが、私の政権の最後の仕事の一つとして、フィードインタリフというヨーロッパでも行われている再生可能エネルギーを比較的高い値段で買い取るという制度を導入しました。
The last thing I did as Prime Minister was to install a feed-in tariff, which you have seen in Europe and elsewhere, but that basically buys renewable energy at a higher price.
その結果、この1年間だけを見ても、太陽光発電による発電量が原発に換算して3基分に上りました。
So that helped in the past year, 1 year, just by solar, Japan has increased the power generation that's worth the 3 nuclear reactors.
そしてさらに、太陽光ばかりではなくて風力やバイオマスによる発電も 急激に拡大しています。
And not just solar, but also wind and biomass power generation in Japan. You see quite a bit of a jump in recent
ただ一つ問題は先ほど申し上げたことと関連するんですが、我が国では送電網もそれぞれの9つの電力会社が地域的に独占的に持っている。そのために例えば北海道というところで風力や太陽光による電気がたくさん生み出すことが可能であってもその地域を独占している北海道電力がこれ以上電力がいらないというとそれを買い取らせることが難しい、こういう問題が現在生じています。
But one problem in Japan is that those regional, power companies that has regional monopoly also has monopoly on transmission just of the power lines. So, for instance, if you have a situation where a Hokkaido power company, that's up in the north, the island of Hokkaido, if they have sort of large amounts of energy created by wind power, if they have surplus, if they want to sell it, they have trouble doing so because of the monopoly.
今そういう発電をしている電力会社から送電部門を切り離すべきだという意見がこれはもうヨーロッパではほとんど行われていることですが、我が国でも強くなってまして、それをぜひ推し進めたいと、これは現在の与党である自民党の中にも進めるべきだという意見がありますので、推し進めたいともうこう考えています。
So today there is an argument for basically separating the power generation from transmission. So, and that idea, it hasn't been hasn't manifested yet, but there, you see support among the current, party that has a rule over Japanese government. So we'll see where it goes.
こういう改革を進めることによって、10年あるいはもう少し経てば十分に原発で少なくなった発電を再生可能な自然エネルギーで賄うことができると考えています。
With all these innovations, renovations, and changes in Japanese systems and regulations, maybe in 10 years we may be able to, increase the renewable energy supply and to meet the demand in Japan.
また先ほどドイツの例を挙げられましたが、ドイツはさらに意欲的な目標を持っています。さらに意欲的な目標を持っています。
In Germany, somebody mentioned Germany, but they actually have a very ambitious goal too.
つまりは2050年までには化石燃料も使うことをやめて、すべての必要なエネルギーを再生可能な自然エネルギーで賄うという目標です。
Their goal is to use and rely entirely on renewable energy by year 2050. Yes?
で、私はこれは我が国でも努力をすれば可能だし、アメリカを含む他の国でもそちらにイノベーションの力を注げば十分可能だと考えています。
And this can be achieved in Japan as well, I believe, and also in the United States. Through innovation and other possibilities.
Mr. Gunderson, you.
ours about that. But hats off to the Germans for trying it. They are some of their publications are against it, and you'll read a lot in the press that it's failing miserably, and some are very much for it. But so far, it's been a success. Of course, they shut down 9 of their power plants immediately. The oldest plants in Germany shut down.
Maybe less.
Shut down immediately. And you got to remember, Angela Merkel is a physicist, and had been pro-nuclear, like Prime Minister Kahn, before the accident. So I think they saw, and when I was in Japan, I spoke about this too. There's an opportunity here to make money. And here's a major exporter of technology, the Germans, and potentially a major exporter of technology, the Japanese, who could start this experiment in their own country and work out the bugs and then sell it to the rest of us. So there's an opportunity here to make some money, and I hope the Germans succeed. And right now they're on a course to do just that.
Okay. Thank you. We literally have 2 minutes left. Let's try to maybe get 2 questions in about Pilgrim. If residents of Cape Cod cannot be evacuated in case of a nuclear catastrophe at Pilgrim, who is accountable for neglecting that community? Are there legislative fixes that can make or hold energy accountable for Pilgrim? Who's it for? Well, if you'd like to take it, Senator Wolf, do you have thoughts on legislative fixes to hold energy accountable?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is yes, and we're going to keep trying. You know, the answer you get on a state level is this is a federal issue, and that, you know, every time we ask the question, we keep getting the answer that it's a federal issue. We're going to keep asking that question because the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency does have responsibility for approving evacuation plans. And so there is a state component, and we just have to keep the pressure on and keep asking the question. And you might have a...
Well, yeah, and I think one of the challenges, and this is it is a problem, it's a difficult challenge, is that the NRC doesn't really require, and Peter touched on this a little bit, the emergency plans don't have a safety requirement attached to it. They are planning standards. So that's part of the challenge, is that there's no metric for a plan to be effective. There's a metric for plans to be in place. And I don't mean that to be facetious. I mean, that's the reality. That, I mean, they're done by professionals, and again, they're not people who intend them to be jokes. I mean, they're serious plans. But the regulatory standard, which then applies to the licensee, is that they develop these plans working with the state, working with the local government, depending on how the state handles emergency response activities. And that's really what the standard is. So, like what I've heard here is that, so if you're Cape Cod residents, essentially your evacuation routes put you potentially through closer to the plant than further away. And so in principle, the concern is that would give you additional dose. Well, there's no dose-based standard with the evacuation plans that, the plant cannot operate if the plan would require that people get an additional, 10 milligram of dose in the course of the evacuation. That's just not the way the structure's set up. So it's more about having a plan in place that, achieves some goals, some higher performance-based goals, but there's no real finite requirement that those goals be about health and safety and saving dose. And that's one of the issues. Something as chairman I tried to change. I made several proposals actually to do that, but I think Peter touched on that. People recognize when you start to do that, then, all of a sudden these plans become unworkable. They truly don't, then they really become unworkable in a way.
The other aspect of the federal-state relationship to keep in mind is that the preemptive features of the Atomic Energy Act, the parts that say states have no role, aren't written in stone. Senator Markey would be just the person perhaps amend those features. It doesn't make sense to have two systems of regulation of plant operation and plant construction probably, but as to whether the state should have the ability to step in and say no either to a new plant or at the point of relicensing or some other key decisional time, you know, the different systems work differently. My understanding is that in Japan, Prime Minister Kan played a role in giving the prefectures a greater voice in whether or not the plants could operate, and that's playing a significant role now in the possibilities of restart.
Also, somebody asked me, you know, is there, aside from the legislative aspect, is there potentially a judicial aspect or legal aspect that could say the Commonwealth could be sued for actually not fulfilling its obligation to provide adequate, adequate escape plans or adequate evacuation plans? And I think, you know, I think somebody's probably looking into that.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, thank you very much. They've removed our heat source, so we better draw it to a conclusion now. Thank you very much for coming and for your great questions.
You remain. I think you're aware of that. I think that it's inconceivable. And we got to keep it
Yep, that's his office. Are you doing any similar? Ah, okay. 襲撃議員の会員だと思います。いいですか？もしかしたらお昼ご一緒にしてもいいですか？ありがとうございます。これがそうなんです。そうだから避難計画は泳ぐかそういうこれがそういうでも結局これしか方法がないと思う。And we have to go to lunch. Excuse us. Yeah. So, take care. Thank you. Teamwork. My brain goes blank, you know, right?
Well, they're appointed by the president, by the Congress. They are really, thank you very much. Independent regulatory agency.
Arigato.
But I mean, the oversight comes to the Congress. So
Yeah. Hi, Hattie.
Thank you very much. I'm boss. The Federal Energy Regulatory, these so-called independent regulatory. Trying to get people to move up there to the health care.
him thrilled. What's interesting about that is, I was being a little bit facetious, but if you look at the backup of the normal tourist evacuation, and you compound that with everybody from Plymouth trying to get away. If you remember, we were on the hurricane at Guard, and we backed up on the Cape, that was just about hurricane, never actually and it was just the Cape Guard that our so we've got gridlock the entire southeastern part of the state, just basically stopped. So, I mean, I think one Brad thing related but not exactly that. You get the traffic model to actually run a computer simulation. Because that way you can so that's something to think about. They've got good models of deep recognition. We can do that on the page. You know, I checked with Greg, who was the head of the